Okay, hey guys, welcome back to episode 2 of the Breaking the Monolith Podcast. I titled this episode "A Son of the Confederate" because I have a good friend here, Vincent Balducci, or as I like to call him, Vinny. But before we go into the podcast, like I said, he's my guest. But Vinny, go ahead and give a brief background of yourself, what you do, what life looks like, your affiliation with, your Confederate chapter. I don't know, just introduce yourself.
Sure
Characterize
thing.
yourself. Yeah.
So hey y'all, I am Vinny. Some people call me Cousin Vinny. I just also want to preface this by saying, as a little disclaimer, the views and opinions are my own, solely my own. I do not represent the SCV in any way, shape, or form, nor do I speak on their behalf or anything like that. However, I am the son of 4 Confederate descendants, one of them being General Joe Wheeler. I belong to the Heritage Group, the Sons of Confederate Veterans, also Military Order of the Stars and Bars. Basically the group that is, if you are related to a general, you would join. And our group is a men's group. We are open to all men who have direct or collateral, including a cousin many times removed, ancestor who served in the Confederacy. We are a heritage group. We are not a hate group. We do not tolerate hate in any way, shape, or form. Any members who are in bad legal standing, or if they're found out to be part of any extremist group, whether that's left wing, right wing, or anything else in between, we kick them out, or we do not admit them if they are being admitted. Their information gets saved, and they are banned from joining any other camp in the future. We also have camps in Europe, Brazil, Australia, and Hawaii, and Alaska.
Wait a minute. There's chapters in Brazil. Are you serious?
Oh, you betcha. Many of the Southerners.
Wait, how does that work? How does that work? I didn't know that.
Oh, of course. So what happened was after the war, you got to remember that the South was pretty much decimated. So people were left with different options. Some of them went up north, like General Pryor. He was a group of many Northerners, many Southerners who moved north, and they tried to reestablish their lives. Other people went west, like California, Washington, Native Hawaiians. They served on the SS Shenandoah, which was a warship. Warships never get talked about at all during the war. A good majority of them packed up and they left, and they went through Mexico, through Central America, and ended up in Brazil. I have located a Confederate grave that is in Honduras. It is decently common to find quite a few of them in South America. And every year they do a celebration of the Confederados, and that is in their language, celebrating the Confederacy. It's their ancestors that all get together and they do a huge show. It's interesting because that is well respected and well received there compared to even in some places in the USA. Other places like France.
I'm going to start calling you Grave Hunter. Is it okay?
Go ahead. I love it. It's actually a committee I'm on, so I do a lot of the graves.
No, I'm like so serious, guys. Though he hunt graves for a living, pretty much. I'm joking, but
and I find their history out. So it's basically stuff that was undiscovered or long forgotten about.
All right, so this is not Vinny. This is Grave Hunter now.
This is Grave Hunter. Cousin Vinny the Grave Hunter.
All right, but I like that you gave the disclaimer, so I want to offer my disclaimer as well. So, as you guys know, the whole purpose of Breaking the Monolith Podcast, because I hate monolithic thought, I hate collective thought. I like to call this a rebel zone. I've been calling it this for the longest, but no pun intended, because we have a Confederate person in here. So my version of like rebelness it has nothing to do with that, but it means something like exclusive to me. But this is a safe space, for people with unique opinions. I don't like censorship. I don't like, to take away people's freedom of speech. I think if you have a opinion, even if it's crazy, if it's subtle, wild, chaotic, it doesn't matter. I think you should always have a space to elucidate that opinion. Everybody should be able to talk how they want, when they want. But we see so much censorship going around in today's society because of hypersensitivity. Like everyone gets offended, when you say something, and if they don't agree with you, they try to cancel you, dox you. Take your job away, ruin opportunities. That's not this kind of place. So if you're sensitive and if you don't like what you see, just even at the front screen right now, right here, if you don't like it, keep it pushing. This is not the space for you. I don't do sensitive people. Sensitive people are not allowed. So with that being said, like I said, welcome to episode 2 of Breaking the Monolith Podcast. I titled today's episode, what did I say? A Confederate son. Something, I'm going crazy right now, but you guys get the point. But anyway, I have a presentation that I made, and we're going to pretty much kind of break everything down into pieces. So we pretty much talked about the history of Vincent. This next bit is going to be about the general history of like the Confederacy. So I put like a small, brief presentation together, which I must, disclaimer is kind of rooted in my opinion, so it may be slightly biased, but this is factual evidence. This is all based on my research, and I have Vinny here to refute it, go against it, offer his opinion, change my perspective. This is kind of like, change my mind. What's the guy name?
Steven Crowder.
Steven Crowder, yeah. So, I have my own perception when it comes to the whole Confederacy thing and the war and all that stuff. But the whole point of this today is to have somebody to offer a new opinion, a different opinion. I want to learn. And then right after we talk about the general history and we're done with my presentation, we'll talk about like the Confederacy and the correlation between modern politics. So sort of like when we see, because like I've met a ton of people like Vinny who believes that, the Confederacy is not, it doesn't have proper representation in education at all. It's always labeled as racist, bad, angry white people, rednecks. So I think that would be interesting to hear his take on it. And like you said, because he's Native American and Latino.
I'm Latino, Puerto Rican, Native American. And every time someone says the stereotype, a dumb, uneducated redneck, I'm like, well, guess what? I'm not even white. They'll say white redneck. I'm not even white. I don't consider myself a redneck. I'm working my PhD, and and it's great because we have right here, as Cal is super educated as well. So two educated men having discussion, as it should be.
Yeah. So, like I said, this is not and wait before I get into that. So after we talk about the education aspect, we'll talk about the hypersensitivity and how people around America want to pass all these laws and stuff to bring down statues. I'm sure everybody is well aware of the whole Robert E. Lee situation, tearing down his statues, and they've even tore down statues of like Frederick Douglass. Like, people are stupid. Like, I don't
New
understand.
York, badly.
So, I mean, there's a huge culture of tearing down monuments. And, like I said, I may not agree with it, but history is history. It already happened. The whole point of exhibiting history is to leave it on display so people can learn from like the past, to not repeat it. Like, I just don't understand people. But statues is like a form of art to me, which is why I think we should always talk about that. Art is not meant to be agreed with. Art is created through subjective perception. It's created through the artist. But I mean, art is meant to provoke. People are not always going to get the same perception when it comes to art, when it comes to statues, things like this. So people have to understand what you perceive a statue as is not what another person may perceive a statue as. But hypersensitivity is a culture, it's toxic, and it has to go because it's making everybody stupid and we're not getting anywhere as a society. But like I said, so we're going to talk about general history and we're going to talk about, modern day politics and the Confederacy. But with that being said, we're going to go ahead and get into my little research that I did. Okay. So for people who don't know what the Confederacy is or Confederate States, the Confederate States of America, commonly referred to as the Confederate States or simply the Confederacy, which was an unrecognized breakaway republic in North America that existed from February 8th, 1861 to May 9th, 1865. I got bad hiccups right now all of a sudden. But before I move on, that May 9th date, when I did my research, a couple of sources said that it was May 5th. Some said May 9th. So I don't want anyone coming for me because I don't know if it's actually confirmed. I don't know if you know Vinny, but I guess it's supposed to be the day that it all ended and stuff. But
it's complicated.
Yeah.
It's not easy because what happens is most of the information out there, it comes from an opinion basically. And,
Right.
You'll have different opinions on different things. When did the war start? When did it officially end? And
Right.
everything else in between. In particular, what is known as the war actually ended out west. People don't understand that. The biggest thing, and it's almost like nails on a chalkboard, but I understand the why it's thought about, is they always assume that when General Lee surrendered, that was officially the end of the Civil War, that everything was over, everything was done with, and it actually was not. The war consisted, it was 3 different armies. The last to surrender was a Native American General Stan Waddy, who surrendered, and that officially marked the end of the war, and that was basically May 9th, I believe, or close to.
Well, if you ask me, I mean, I guess since, I wouldn't even say 1865. I would even extend it as long as to 1870, if you ask me, because they were still making arrests on generals and, locking people up, and they were still creating policies and, having all these house meetings, all kinds of things, just to kind of figure this whole Confederate situation out. So it really wasn't all like resolved until like 1870, but it even went past that. So, I mean, I don't know if you can, maybe this is just maybe the date that's subjective to the war, the actual gun and blood type stuff. But I will argue that it goes beyond that in my opinion, but people may disagree, but that's just my opinion. But to move on, why the states withdrew. Between 1860 and 1861, 11 southern states withdrew from the United States and formed the Confederate States of America. The states withdrew in response to the growing movement for the nationwide abolition of slavery. This is what I personally believe, and this is what a lot of my research, stated. But we have Vinny here. I think it's obvious that he may disagree, so I at least want to give you the chance to say what you have to say.
Sure. So some of the viewpoints on that are interesting. In particular, so slavery does get brought up a lot, and it's interesting because people forget that there were northern slave states, and people kind of like raise their eyebrow, like what? So on that map there, you have Delaware and New Jersey and Maryland. Those two were actually Union slave states throughout the entire war. Maryland was basically banned from seceding. Abraham Lincoln, the president, had suspended habeas corpus, and he also would lock people up. So like, let's say Cal here had a newspaper that was pro-union, and I had a newspaper that was pro-Southern, but then maybe he said, well, why don't we just let the South be, and it's not our job to get involved. And then I said, oh, why don't we let Maryland secede? Because both of us dared to critique Abraham Lincoln, potentially that could have gotten us locked up. So by locking people up in Maryland, that's how he prevented secession, and he also locked up those who would have voted. Delaware was a Union slave state until I believe it was February 12th, and I believe it was 1901, and that was slavery on the books legally. New Jersey was the last slave state until January 23rd, 1866, and they freed the last slaves in the nation. And again, this was actually long after Juneteenth. And again, I am not for slavery at all. There is no one in particular would say, oh yeah, slavery was a wonderful thing. No one is absolutely not saying that. What happened though is that abolition was an interesting ideal because it did begin in the South, but how it was implemented varied. Certain states like New Jersey refused to do any kind of abolition. They just changed the words around, and they did some laws that made slavery a legal thing. And they also passed laws that would ban any free men from moving in to the state at all or owning property. So then it became the issue with New Jersey, which was debated about when the last slaves were freed in New Jersey, where do they go? Because they can't, own property in New Jersey. They were forced to go down south. Pennsylvania, for example, because people don't know this, they did gradual abolition, but it was very gradual at a snail's pace. New York had cases of illegal slavery that were not punished. Kentucky was a Union slave state, as was Missouri. And
I like how you say Missouri instead of Missouri.
Right, everyone says Missouri. I'm like, it's Missouri. And
wait, is it really? Is it really?
It is. We call it Missouri. They always say the rebel form of it is Missouri.
I'm born and raised. I'm from Missouri. We call it the Show Me State. We call it Missouri, but I've never heard Missouri. That's new to me. Born and raised, but I moved away from Missouri about 4.5 years ago. So nice state though. But yeah, I did not know it was called Missouri. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
Missouri was another example. I had a book somewhere. So this was an example because I know a lot of people, and again, this is the issue I find because as you know, I tend to be more independent politically. Mm-hmm. You have the Republicans that will basically call the Democrat, you're the slave party, you're this and that, in a way to basically get votes. And then they'll say, we're the party of Lincoln, we freed the slaves, which I think is a pretty poor way of trying to sell your party to someone because it can be a little offensive.
Wait, disclaimer, because Abraham Lincoln, and I'm sure, me personally, before I let him talk, I do not support Abraham Lincoln. I don't like Abraham Lincoln. And I think the history taught about Abraham Lincoln is jacked up. It's all a lie. Like, Abraham Lincoln did not have the intent to free slaves, but I should make a podcast on that separately. But before we talk about that, I want to pull something up. Horace Greeley, Abraham Lincoln. My spelling is all over the place. PDF. Can you see this, Vinny?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'm trying to see if I can find we probably can just use that one, but it doesn't matter. We'll just, this is the original, but I don't think, it's not clear enough. So we're just going to use, it's the same thing. But this is a letter that President Abraham Lincoln wrote to Horace Greeley in 1862. And let me find the quote where it says, okay, so he says, as to the policy I seem to be pursuing, as you say, I have not meant to leave anyone in doubt. I will save the Union. I will save it the shortest way under the Constitution. The sooner the national authority can be restored, the nearer the Union will be the Union as it was. If there be those who will not save the Union unless they could at the same time save slavery, I do not agree with them. If there be those who will not save the Union unless they could at the same time destroy slavery, I do not agree with them. This is the most interesting part right here after reading all that. My paramount objective is this struggle to save the Union, and it's not either to save or destroy slavery. He admits right here that he does not care. He does not care. He doesn't care if he saves it. He doesn't care what happens to it. He doesn't care if it continues. He doesn't care. So it's just interesting to know that they kind of teach history like the way, like growing up, the way I learned about Abraham Lincoln was, oh, he was this great emancipator and he saved African American people, which is ironic because even after the Emancipation Proclamation, slavery still went on. Like slavery did not end. So it's like, I don't know why they teach this history about Abraham Lincoln. I don't know if it's like Republican propaganda, you know, trying to get votes and manipulate and indoctrinate people. But Abraham Lincoln is not the man that America tells us that he is. The education system lies about him. But I don't know. I kind of would like your opinion on Abraham Lincoln really quickly. What do you think?
So Abraham Lincoln, I definitely think that people, especially Republicans, tend to put him on a pedestal, and they basically use him in a way that he wasn't. They portray him more godlike and this great emancipator when he originally would have been the great deporter, because he had a plan then to basically take anyone who was freed and ship him over. The other thing that's interesting with Lincoln is I have not gotten the book yet, but I will get back to you after I read it. There's a book that just came out and it had evidence that Lincoln actually owned slaves. And that was interesting. We do know that his wife, which is Mary Todd Lincoln, she came from a prominent slavery family,
I didn't know
which was interesting. And like, there's a marker for her actually in my state. People don't know that fact about her at all. They also had some interesting things between the two of them. So the one thing that is interesting with Lincoln as well is he knew how to spin his words in a way that would create propaganda. And this would further hurt the South in the way that, we were trying to get recognized by other countries. And Lincoln, by trying to make the war, which was more than halfway through the war, seem about slavery, was a way to kind of make the war seem more palatable on the Union side. It was a way of, mass producing propaganda. And a lot of the soldiers were oblivious to this on both sides of the war. If you had asked a lot of the soldiers on both sides, a lot of them didn't even know what they were fighting for. Slavery hardly gets brought up.
Right.
There was a woman actually in Missouri, and it was Rhonda Ray.
Wait, I'm gonna need you to stop. We're gonna say Missouri for now. No Missouri.
Missouri.
Not on this podcast. Missouri. I cannot.
So there was a woman there, Rhonda Ray, and she was a woman of color. And what she did was during the Battle of Oak Hills, she was about in her 30s. She sought refuge in John Ray's farmhouse. And what happened was she would nurse Confederate soldiers back to health. She was a nurse. And believe it or not, because Missouri.
No, I was joking with you. You can say Missouri. I was joking. You can say Missouri.
So Missouri was not in rebellion on January 1st, 1863. When the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect, she's not even freed or allowed to be free until 1865. So she was enslaved, but because of the Emancipation Proclamation, completely stomped it out.
Wow.
Because there's a complicated history with that state. It was a weird state. It was a lot of division in that state, much like Kentucky, West Virginia. That was another example. That was admitted into the Union as a slave state, and people don't know that. So even though a lot of West Virginia was dead against secession, a lot of them were indifferent to the issue of slavery. And I use the other example of different states having different opinions, because I believe it was only like 4 or so that mentioned slavery in their ordinance of secession, because there were parts of it, but at the whole context of things, a lot of the issues, what it boiled down to was tax tariffs. And there is some proof that, Lincoln was just kind of like finally lighting the match on a puddle of gasoline that had been building, because there were tax tariffs of the early 1800s that were put into place to help the United States recover from the War of 1812.
Right.
Many people don't know the War of 1812. I'm also a descendant of a War of 1812 veteran, 2 of them. It was a war that we lost badly. It was extremely horrible. We lost so many American lives in the War of 1812. I think it was just over twice the amount of British who died, and we did not win that. What ended the war was a peaceful truce between Britain, and I believe Canada was also involved in some way, And USA and Britain says, okay, there's going to be a ceasefire. Here are the terms and conditions. After that, they were badly taxing the South with tax tariffs. So what happened was you would have a lot of wealth up north and a lot of poverty down south among everyone, basically. So the one issue was that the South was being taxed to death, and that was another issue of the war and the election, actually, that kind of got the ball rolling on this. And when it came to secession, there were certain states that were really not for it. So Virginia, for example, was up in the air. And it wasn't until Lincoln invaded that finally pushed Virginia, and it pushed General Lee to take a stand. Lee did not want to secede. The other person that we have, he's buried in New Jersey, Colonel Edward Parke Custis Lewis, he did not want to secede, and he says simply, I'm for the Union cause. I am against the rebellion. And then finally, when Virginia was invaded, he said, I have to stand with my mother's state. I have to stand by my state herself, Virginia, and that's why I'm fighting. He actually walked away completely. His family was agriculture. He said, I want nothing to do with agriculture. Didn't do anything with agriculture. He went in to study law. And that's what he did the remainder of his life in New Jersey. He wasn't like the other people. There were people that were farmers. In particular, my ancestors were farmers, and I had one that was a musician. He fought for Alabama. He was a musician in the war. He was held in a prison. And that's the other thing they don't talk about.
Well, that's good to know.
Also, the states, how they're represented, because people will kind of debate the number, and this is where it gets tricky. Certain people think that there was 15 Confederate states, and the two that are included in that is Maryland and Delaware. So, for example, there is the Lloyd Tillman flag. His house is in Kentucky. Learn a lot about him. And the other one is the Georgia Fowler Guards flag, and it is a 15-star Confederate battle flag. These right here are the nationals. That is the first official one, and it included 7 stars for the 7 states. And then as another state seceded, they added another one to it. Problem with that one is it was too similar to the USA flag. They wanted to keep a lot of the ideals of the USA in their flag design. However, on the battlefield, bad idea, because it looked too similar.
Right.
They then came out with the 13th star, which would be the last 2 official Confederate flags. That one was the final and official one, which is the bloodstained banner, includes St. Andrew's Cross and the 13 stars. In terms of states, there really was about...
Wait, 11. So the one, I can't really see because your head is in the way. The one in the middle, is that the same one as, oh no, they're different. Okay, what's the one in the middle one more time?
This one is a stainless banner. It is the second national flag, and this was made about 2 years into the war. They needed a flag that was different. No one knows the man who made this one. They actually give the wrong person. There's a meme that's false. The man that was in part responsible for this was a Princeton University graduate, Alexander Boteler. Probably butchered his last name, but that's okay. He was on the committee that designed this because they wanted something that was original, something that you could differentiate in the battlefield, and something to honor the armies, which was the emblem. However, the problem with this one is it looked too much like a surrender flag, especially if the wind wasn't blowing. So it wasn't until later on that they added the red stripe that would make the final Confederate flag, the bloodstained banner, more distinguishable.
It's so interesting to know that all those flags were created for the same thing, basically, but this goes to show that how history is lying to us, because, if I would have never met somebody like you or, done my research, I would have just thought it was, this standard, what we typically see in the mainstream media, So to see
not at all.
Yeah, to see all those flags behind you, it goes to show that there's a lot of information, a lot of history that all of us are missing out on. So that's why I think self-education is the best. I'm not really a big fan of institutionalized, commercialized education for obvious reasons, because most of us don't even know what half that stuff is on your wall back there. I'm just being honest.
Oh yeah, and there's other ones, like for Kentucky, for example, they would do a lot of the ones that were in the shape of a Christian cross, and they would do a star for each state. Missouri or Missouri, depending on how you say it. They did the Quantrell's battle flag, and I'll never forget this. During a living history event on Flag Science, I brought a few flags, and I had the Quantrell's Raiders battle flag, which is basically a black flag with a little Q at the side of it.
Right.
Oh my goodness, I had a woman come up to me and she goes, "Oh, are you a QAnon supporter?" And I go, "What the heck are you told? What the heck is a QAnon?" I didn't know what that was. She kept pointing to the Q, and then she shows me a picture. Well, apparently that conspiracy theory hijacked the Q that was on the Quantrell's Raiders battle flag.
Wow, I did not know that.
Yeah, it's a flag that no one really knows what it is, but it's all black with a small white Q in the little dyslexic here left hand side.
Wait, you know what? Before we hold on, I didn't cut you off. Go ahead, and I'll say what I'm going to say after you're done.
Sure thing. And the other ones that they have in Missouri or Missouri is a lot of them used crosses. So they had the Missouri battle flag, which is a cross and a blue background. People mistake it for the Christian flag. They also had some really weird designs, like the Van Dorn flag that included moons and all these wonderful flags. And I always try to rotate my flags and also try to make handouts because there was a lot of diverse flags that existed under the CSA. Most of the Union flags were very basic.
Well, that's good to know. So I think I won't say too much on the flags because I'm not going to act like I know everything. I definitely don't know enough about the flags because apparently there's like 20,000 different versions. I got to learn the significance of each one and the time periods and things like that. But I wanted to say something because I noticed before you move on, you mentioned how there was still slavery up in like northern states, Union states. And I just think it's so interesting to see how states who emphasize the importance of freedom and liberty and why African Americans should have not been slaves and why colonialism should have not happened, but yet you guys still have thousands and thousands of slaves. I don't know, that's really interesting to me. I would never understand why that is, but I mean, maybe it's a power thing. Once you get power and you kind of want to keep it in.
It is. And it's also the issue that when a lot of people talk about Jim Crow, which was a horrible time in our history, Jim Crow was actually long in existence up north. And there were laws up north that were very discriminatory towards people of color and also Jews. So believe it or not, there were a lot of northern laws that were anti-Semitic in nature. And what happened was you would see a lot of Jewish people fought for the Confederacy. In particular, Charleston, South Carolina had one of the largest Jewish populations. One of them was Judah P. Benjamin. He served in the Confederate Congress, and he was the first American Jew to serve in any level of government completely. And that's the one thing I was shocked to learn. I did a seminar on, and I'm like, wow, like this is a law that I would never imagine because I never even thought of another potentially minority group that would be dealing with stuff like this. I also found here, this was on I believe it was a podcast from the Abbottville Institute from Clyde Wilson on September 1st, 2014 on Reconstruction. And he talked a little bit about Illinois, which was Lincoln's home state. Wow. And it said by a 2-to-1 popular majority, Illinois in 1862 adopted a new constitution which forbade Black people to enter the state. Lincoln's friend and supporter, Senator Trumbull, remarked, start quote, "There is a very great aversion against having free Negroes come among us. Our people want nothing to do with the Negro," end quote. Shortly after, Secretary of War Stanton took note of the large number of ex-slaves who had gathered around the army in Cairo, Illinois, who were in a very sick and impoverished condition. He ordered them dispersed through Illinois, and in fact, some rich Chicagoans have requested that choice Blacks be sent to them as servants. Public meetings of protest were held all over Illinois, and leaders, both Republican and Democrat, criticized the move. Defenders of this government assured the people that it was only temporary, and after the war, the Blacks would be shipped back to the South. Salmon P. Chase of Ohio, abolitionist member of Lincoln's cabinet and later Chief Justice, expected that with emancipation, start quote, "the Blacks of the North will slide southward and leave no question to quarrel about," end quote.
That sounds about right. But I mean, also, I think it's also important to know, like a lot of people think that the northern region at the time could have not been racist because they were more progressive and they were, anti-slavery. But I mean, also look at the fact that these were, a lot of people consider the northern region, the smart white people because they industrialized and commercialized the northern region. They started to build all these Ivy Leagues and, things like that. But most of those Ivy Leagues were built in like the 1600s, and the first African Americans weren't even admitted into those universities until like the late 1800s. So it's like the same people who were like promoting, liberty, freedom, and free to Black slaves, they didn't have access to those Ivy Leagues and those banks and those housing markets. It was not like that. But it's funny because you can even kind of connect that to today and look at like white liberalism up north. And it's like, it's kind of the same, like, they care so much about Black oppression and, they do all that Black Lives Matter and Stop Asian Hate and, all those racial progressive movements, but you don't see minority people acquiring opportunities up there. It's sort of like kind of now so I don't know. I just kind of see a huge correlation between the two, but yeah, let's move on. So yeah, we pretty much talked about this, but the 11 states, the Confederate States of America, was a collection of 11 states that seceded from the United States in 1860, following the election of President Abraham Lincoln, led by Jefferson Davis, and existing from 1861 to 1865. The Confederacy struggled for legitimacy and was never recognized as a sovereign nation. And for those who don't know, I believe Jefferson Davis, and quote me if I'm wrong, but I believe he was the founder, president of the whole Confederate, States of America. Is that correct?
That is correct. He was elected, and I believe it was Alabama. They elected him there. The first White House of the Confederacy was in Alabama. Another big mistake that he made was in order to make the Confederate Congress, because as you know, when you're starting a nation, it's very difficult,
Right.
especially in this situation. You had to then get a president, get a Congress, get representatives. You had to get a flag made for your nation. All these things came crashing down at once, so you had to quickly do everything. Now, Alabama on a map, if you looked at that, that was in a pretty good location. He decided to move the White House all the way to Richmond. Bad idea, because that's basically near enemy lines. And on top of that, his wife was interesting because it's not that she wasn't well received, it's that, people were a little interested in her because she actually came from a prominent Northern family. Verena Howell Davis, the first lady of the Confederacy, her family was Northern, and her grandfather was actually the third governor of our state of New Jersey.
I did not know that.
And it was also part of the reason why after the war, she was able to take her family and they went to New York. She was a member of one of the early organizations up there that would help the South. And she was able to also pull some strings to help get President Jefferson Davis out of prison.
As you guys can see, he's like a walking Confederate textbook. So I'm kind of glad he agreed to do this podcast with me. But I'm curious, Vinny, when you do because I know you said you're a PhD student, so obviously you've been in school, in college for, quite some time. When you do projects and stuff, do you always do when you choose your topics, is it always does it always pertain to the Confederacy, or do you focus on other things too? Because I mean, dates from A to Z, when buildings were built, when they were built, how they were built, who built them, why they were moved, for what purpose. I think that's so fascinating. I do, but I don't know. When you do projects, do you always do them on the Confederacy, or I don't know?
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I try to do my best. I tell people all the time, I do not know everything. There is still stuff that I am learning. And I tell people all the time, if I don't know something, I always say, well, I don't know, and I'll have to do more research, because that's how it should be. For the most part, believe it or not, most of the stuff that I've studied and have talked about primarily have been about personality, assessments, personality disorders, that area of abnormal psychology. I've talked a little bit about the current healthcare systems, how it could be reformed, how it could be made better, for true equity and stuff that people aren't even thinking about. And once in a while, I have touched upon it, nothing in detail, but I've talked about how I would be more than happy to use my men's group to help current veterans that are struggling. So we try to find ways to do community outreach. We try to do community service projects.
Well, I think that's that's really important. I didn't mean to interrupt you, because I bring it up all the time. I feel like everyone talks about how, we support our veterans and we love our veterans, but nobody actually creates initiatives to help them out. I mean, yeah, they go over to all these foreign nations and they protect the country and do the best they can. But when they come back over here, not only are a lot of them homeless and sleep under bridges, which is an issue for one, but the other issue is that a lot of them have PTSD and a lot of, mental illnesses, and America doesn't know how to treat mental illness. We rather criminalize mental illness, because if you can't get a certain job because you have anxiety or depression, or, you're schizophrenic. People have to understand that, as human beings, you go through things and you experience things, and essentially down the line, you kind of develop, mental issues. But there's no initiative. There's nobody that cares about veterans. So I think that's something you should really look into, because I think, veteran psychology should be something that should be greatly prioritized, especially if we're going to keep sending people to go over to these foreign nations to fight, shoot, and kill and see all these egregious things. But, I think America is the worst place to treat mental health. I don't care what anybody says, but I blame it on Western medicine. I do.
I agree with you.
We criminalize mental illness too much. And, that's why veterans, have a high suicide rate, but nobody wants to acknowledge it. But that's besides the point. But before we move on, anything else you want to say?
Quickly, believe it or not, it was actually this war. It was a civil war that we were we had to also advance medicine. That was something, and that's probably a topic for a later day, but basically soldier's heart, which was the disorder that they would coin back then, were the symptoms of PTSD. And that was kind of the diagnosis that would evolve later on, because we started getting the idea that these men after the war were wounded both physically and emotionally. There were men that on both sides of the war that sadly ended their own lives. There were men that struggled with addiction, because as you know, like the best drug that you had in the battlefield was alcohol. So basically you were giving people alcohol, a lot of it, so they didn't feel the pain of you taking their limb off. Not to sound morbid, but after that, there was people that struggled with pain. So like the founder of Coca-Cola, that was a Confederate veteran. He made Coca-Cola as a way to try to help. He originally marketed it for veterans who were struggling with addiction and for women that were single, that were struggling with addiction. Again, did the Coca-Cola work? Not really. He ended up succumbing to his addiction. So did his son. He died penniless. I believe he is buried in Georgia, if I'm not mistaken.
It's so funny you say that, because I just learned that about 3-4 months ago, that it was a Confederate, individual that you said he was a soldier, correct? Confederate soldier, or what was he?
Yes, he was a Confederate soldier.
Yeah, but basically I was scrolling on Instagram one time, this is about 3-4 months ago, and I saw, I think it was one of your friends actually that posted it or something that I was following, and it said something about a Confederate soldier or something creating Coca-Cola, and I was like, wow, because I live,
Pepper too.
yeah, I live in Georgia currently, and it's like, Georgia is, if you go to Georgia, anybody who lives in Georgia, especially Atlanta, like Coca-Cola is such a big thing there. Like you can literally, during the summertime, you can go to like Centennial Park and there'll be just like groups giving away free Coca-Colas, bottles and cans of Coke. Like it's just, we have just an abundance of Coke in Atlanta. Like you can just give it away for free. That's how serious, like, but it's an entire culture there. So that's interesting to know that. I guess Coke was initially created for medicinal purposes. Is that what you're trying to say?
It was originally to help people with addiction, particularly veterans and ladies that were struggling. That was how it was marketed. Coca wine was actually the name for it. It was more of like an herbal remedy, but they changed a lot. Obviously, the formula is drastically different than what it once was, because they can't advertise it like that anymore. But yeah,
that's good to know. So yeah, Coca-Cola does not put Coke in it, guys. Not anymore. So had to break it to you. No cocaine for you. All right, so I kind of wanted to get into this. So this is kind of more of, we're kind of like get more into the gritty side of it. But so when I was doing my research on the Confederacy, because as you know, I do disagree with a lot of what the mainstream media puts out, and I do disagree with a lot of the philosophies of the Confederacy. I do believe that the Confederacy was rooted in deep Westernization, that was rooted in deep racism and ideas of white nationalism. But I'm going to give my analysis and my basic research as to why I believe that, and then you can pretty much come back and tell me what you think. But I pulled up this document from, and I believe this was from his Cornerstone speech, Alexander Stevens. And I know a lot of people don't know about the Cornerstone speech, but we'll talk about that after I'm done with this. But so this is Alexander Stevens on slavery in the Confederate Constitution of 1861. And in the Cornerstone speech, or in the document that I have right here, I might just go ahead and just pull it up. I'm just reading first. Okay, our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite ideas. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstones, I can't talk right now, cornerstones set rest upon a great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race is his natural and moral condition. This our new government is the first in the history of the world based upon the great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. So wait, maybe I have it. Yeah, I actually have it pulled up right here. So I got this from the American Yop, I believe that's Yop reader. But like I said, this is Alexander Stevens on slavery in the Confederate Constitution of 1861, and I believe he was the vice president of the Confederate States of America. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And right here, this is where I got this excerpt from, where he talks about I guess, he makes a claim that there's an intrinsic difference between the white man and the black man, and, kind of why they position should be what it is. And, I don't know. So he says it's like this is objective truth. He says it's like this is fact. And this is kind of where my first reasoning for thinking that the Confederacy was rooted in, racism. Like I said, I do acknowledge that there was good and bad on both sides, and we can also get into the reason as to why I think that, because I also want to talk about Black Confederate soldiers, because I know you have a lot of good information on that. But I just find it interesting when people think that the Confederacy is not rooted in racism. And, some people just completely just like throw it out the window. Like I said, do I think the entire Confederacy was racist? No, because I do, according to my research, there were some people who really did do some good things and who did not want slavery. And it was all about Southern heritage and things like that. But initially, the people who founded, the whole idea of Confederacy and seceding from the states and, keeping our westernization, our white male culture, these were the people who founded it. And this is a fact. This is from the vice president himself. And this is a claim that he made. This is what he wrote. This is what he spoke. So, I mean, I don't know. What do you have to say about this? Because I do find this very alarming. And a lot of people don't know that,
Absolutely. So that's a thing that we get a lot. And we do get the Cornerstone speech brought up a bit. And what's interesting is, because when I first read this, I was like shocked. And then I spoke. Very nice woman. I don't know if you know who Teresa Roan is. She's a historian. And so basically there was a museum of the Confederacy that was in Richmond, Virginia. Long story short, the museum is no more. It is now the American Civil War Museum. And basically she no longer works there, but she does do a lot of educating. Right. I have not been blessed to take her program yet. She does an incredible one on men of color in the Confederacy. And this one is interesting. So I have this document that says, I am told that, as it is usually the case.
Wait, hold on, Vinny. Before you go on, you probably forgot because we've been talking so much, but you also can share screen. So I don't know if you're using like a tablet or something, but if you want to share screen, you also have the rights to do that. Oh, well, go ahead. So, okay.
Yeah, I just, only because my eyes are like, I don't want to like be at the screen. She says, I am told that, as is usually the case, all my opposition today has to prove their point that the Confederacy was racist, is the so-called Cornerstone speech by Alexander Stephens. I wonder if they're aware that this speech, as we know it, is actually a transcription written and published by a newspaper reporter and not the actual speech. Stephens rebutted his speech and corrected several errors in the transcripts regarding the issues of slavery, telling the reporter he had taken his words out of context, but the reporter omitted the corrections. Stephens addressing those in his own diary in 1865, stating, start quote, my own opinion of slavery, as often expressed, was that if the institution was not the best or could not be made the best for both races, looking to the advancement and progress of both physically and morally, it ought to be abolished. It was far from being what it might and ought have been. Education was denied. This was wrong. I ever condemned the wrong. Marriage was not recognized. That was a wrong that I condemned. Many things connected with it did not meet my approval, but excited my disgust, abhorrence, and disdain. End quote.
Wait, I want to say something because that's really interesting to me before you go on, because you mentioned education, and I noticed when I did my research on not Alexander Stephens, Jefferson Davis. So I read this book that talked about how he was like pro education for African-American slaves. The funny thing was he didn't want to free them. He did not free them, but he had a school for them. He taught them how to read, taught them how to write. And there's this document that I found, and it talks about how, first of all, this is, so the source I'm using, this is from the Johns Hopkins University Press and Jefferson Davis, The Negroes and the Negro Problem. But on page 412, when I was reading, this was just really interesting to me because it says the Negroes were allowed the usual plantation privileges, but up here it talks about, it's so much on here. Oh, where is it at? Basically, this one Negro girl refused to wait over the overseer's wife because, contrary to her master's rule, she had been called out in her name, Rose instead of Rosina. A man who was disobedient had threatened the overseer. Asked Miss Davis, "How do you expect us to believe in them poor white trash when we people has a master that fit and whipped everybody?" The Negroes were allowed the usual plantation privileges. Each family had its patch for vegetables, fruit, pigs, and chickens, which were raised for their own. Anyway, you go on and go on. It talks about how we perceive slaves, in shackles and chains and, not having privileges. I don't really want to read the entire thing, but education was also mentioned, but they had special privileges. They can have little forms, little fruits, and, they got called by their names and, they weren't, labeled, and like title like pieces of property and things like that. But it's ironic to me because it's like, what is a privilege if you're a slave? I understand you being able to not eat scraps and actually being able to eat vegetables and fruits and actually having a name and having the opportunity to be educated. But it's like, you're in shackles while you get to do all those things. And that's what Jefferson Davis was. It was like, I don't know if this is like cognitive dissonance for Jefferson Davis, because although he didn't beat his slaves and, although he didn't do egregious things to his slaves, in most cases, what's the point? Why do people bring it up? Because I don't look at that as a good thing. If I'm being educated and if I'm being legally allowed to eat apples while my heels are shackled up, it's like, what is that? It's like, give a doggy a treat, enough just to be quiet. That's what it seems like to me. It do. I don't know, but what you think about that?
So it was always interesting is learning about how, like, well, slavery obviously was wrong. No one is saying it's right. General Lee was another one. He was against slavery. General Forrest, believe it or not, while he did own slaves, he was against it and he freed his slaves. And he said right on the battlefield, if we win the war, you're free to go. If we lose the war, you're free to go. What he ended up doing, he says, well, you know what? So you have your freedom. All of y'all are free now. You're welcome to stay and fight with me if you choose, or you're welcome to go home. That was completely an option for him. He also would speak later on for the importance of racial integration after the war, and he also spoke at basically the group before the NAACP came along. There was another group before that, and it was that precursor group. General Beauregard, he actually, after the war, was a Republican, and he spoke for racial integration. He tried to break a lot of the Republicans at the time that were very pro-segregation. He wanted to be more integrative. Now, Davis was interesting because while he was not for slavery, there was something, I have to find the document. I don't have it on me now, but there was something he was in the process of doing, a way of, pushing abolition, getting slavery done with, but it would take time to make sure that you were, educated, you were out basically quicker than what Pennsylvania did, because Pennsylvania had super gradual abolition where it was like years and years and years.
I have read this somewhere, like basically Jefferson Davis was not anti-slavery. He was anti-freeing like ignorant, uneducated slaves. So he wanted to
prevent poverty.
So
you were left with a tough decision, because also slavery, if you think about it, what it probably would have turned into is sharecropping, because basically the form of agriculture, as things were transitioning, I mean, now, like, look at agriculture now, we seldom have, with the exception, there's, the issue of migrant farm workers who are usually paid very little and do some crop work. But for the most part, most things now are technology based. We were at a weird... Let me
ask you a question. Okay. Mm-hmm. Educate me on the logic in that, because we won't free these slaves. We want these slaves to be free. We want these African-American slaves to be free, but we won't free these slaves until we know that they're educated. What's the logic behind that? Because I think any form of slavery is bad, but it's like, what did education look like? What did being educated look like in the eyes of Jefferson Davis? Because, okay, I can say my letter A to Z. Is that enough to get me off the plantation? I can count 1 to 10. Is that enough to get me off? What does education look like in the eyes of Jefferson Davis? I just feel like it's really tricky, and I feel like we're on thin ice when we start to say that people are not entitled to freedom if we don't deem them educated enough to be in the general public.
No, I agree. It's difficult. It's a difficult situation because, and also the important thing is time consistent with the time period. It's not like now that you have the ability to get educated easily on the computer, right, or what education would look like. By today's standards, I think the fact that someone just graduating 5th grade or something, you have more of an education than people back then did, because the standards were a lot different. I think that what he was referring to was more so preventing poverty, which did happen during Reconstruction. So, for example, the Juneteenth order, which I always bring up, a lot of people don't read that order. That was basically martial law. And if you've ever read that order, basically no one was allowed to be freed from the plantation. You had to stay where you were, both white and black. You were not allowed to go anywhere without getting permission from like a Yankee.
I don't know. That's weird to me, because I'm even thinking about, are you familiar with the grandfather clause? Like, you cannot vote unless as a black man, and you cannot vote if your grandfather was not a free slave. Are you familiar with the grandfather clause?
Yes.
And it was just so interesting to me because one of the biggest regulations and stipulations was, in order to vote, was you had to be educated. But it was odd because you could only vote if your grandfather was also educated, but your grandfather was also a former slave, and slaves were education was illegal. So it was like, what is the logic behind it? Because if you know that I cannot get an education because my grandfather is a Black slave, I descend from slaves. First of all, I hold Black skin in a country that does not allow me to become educated. How can I actually vote? What are my options? What are my alternatives? And it's like all these rules and, legislations and these crazy philosophies. Like, I just don't get the logic behind it. It's like, would you shackle somebody up because you deem them uneducated to like go into the general public? Would you really do that?
Personally, no. And it was I think you brought up a good example about it being illegal to be educated, which did happen. But the one thing I thought was interesting was that, I don't know if you know General Stonewall Jackson. He actually broke the laws in his state, where he basically built a church, and it was a Sunday school for Black children and Black folk, and they were able to get taught the word of God, which they were denied before. They were able to get education. And I truly think that if he survived the war, you would see him really push for true ideas of abolition.
Wait, you think slaves were denied the word of God?
Well, like, churches. So for example, and I guess different states do this differently, but with churches in particular, that was something that was
I think slaves were denied a lot of things, but one thing they would not deny was Christianity, baptism, being a Protestant, becoming a Mormon. Like, white slave masters, that made sure that religion was always a part of a slave's lifestyle. Like, I had read this book, it was like a pamphlet, not really a book. And like, I grew up in a Black church. I'm not religious anymore. But I wanted to look into the culture. Where did we get our culture from? So we used to have these deacons and these women that walked around with these plates. They used to have like these white gloves on, one hand behind the back, and they used to have these silver plates. But I have read during like slavery, the white masters had made these slaves, these deacons or whatnot, put these white gloves on because their Black skin was considered dirty and sinful. And Black had a negative connotation back then. But it's so funny because a lot of the practices, social practices that you see within the church today, especially in Black churches, they rooted from slavery. So I definitely don't think, Christianity or religion was something that slaves were denied, because that's how you indoctrinated people. And I've read so many things about slave owners who would use the Bible to like indoctrinate, the Black slaves, and, tell them that, you're inferior. You're supposed to be inferior. God made you beneath us. And, that was the whole point of, telling them that they couldn't read. We're not going to make these Negroes can't read. We're going to put laws against them. We're going to make sure that these Negroes can't read. So when we read to them and we have these white men get on the podium or whatnot and read the book of God, they have no choice but to listen. This white man sounds educated. He sounds smart. He sounds articulate. So it's like, of course, in the eyes of these slaves who were denied the right to read, denied the right to education, but only know the word of God because they're hearing what their ears are receiving. That's all they know. Christianity, God, Christianity, God, Christianity, God, to the point some of them actually believe that this was their position. They believe that they were supposed to be like that. But to even touch up on the war thing, because yes, Jefferson Davis wanted people to be free, but I have found something really, and this is the cornerstone speech, but we don't have to get into that. And we're going to talk about Edward Pollard in a minute. Are you familiar with him?
Yes.
Okay, but in it really quickly, so I just found this really interesting because a lot of people talk about like people like Jefferson Davis and anybody who was a bit like Robert E. Lee, who was a big Confederate like leader, and try to equate them to emancipation and freedom. I just thought it was funny because I had read on a source right here that stated that as Southern losses in the Civil War mounted, Jefferson Davis proposed emancipating slaves in late 1864 and early 1865 with a catch. So like I said, there's always a stipulation and regulation. So yes, he wanted to free people, but there was a catch. What was the catch? He offered a widely criticized plan to grant freedom to any slave willing to fight for the Confederacy. Why? Because they were losing. He was willing to jettison slavery in order to save Southern independence, Cooper said during the 2012 talk at the Virginia Military Institute. But I think this source right here is really good. You should go look into it. But I just thought that was so interesting because it was like you mentioned, you couldn't be free if you were not educated. You couldn't do this if you didn't have that. It was always a stipulation on somebody's freedom. Like, where does that come from? Is that like Westernization? Is that Western religion? Is that a European thing? Because when did stipulations constitute somebody's freedom? I thought everybody was born with freedom. I thought everybody was entitled to freedom. But now all of a sudden these slaves are, they couldn't be free prior to 1864 and 1865, but now all of a sudden, we need more soldiers. First of all, Black soldiers initially, when the Confederacy was founded, a lot of people also don't know this, you could not serve as a Black person in the Confederacy. That happened like later on. If you were Black, you could not serve in the Confederacy. And you can speak on that in a minute, but I just feel like it's just kind of crazy to put all these stipulations and regulations on people's freedom. You can't be free if you don't help us fight the war. You can't be free if you're not educated. You can't do this if you can't do. So I don't know. I just found it really weird. What do you think?
So you actually would love to interview Teresa Roan, because she is truly an expert in this area. She spent years.
Wait, let me write the name down. Her name is what?
Teresa Roan.
Teresa Rome, Rome.
Roane.
Roane. Roan. Okay, got it. Okay, go ahead.
She actually is a descendant too. She is Black. She's a descendant of a Confederate ancestor, and she did a lot of research in this department, and she keeps pulling out more evidence. So what made the Confederate armies a lot different than the Union armies is the fact that Confederate armies were integrated. Mm-hmm. Whether you were Native, with the exception usually of Native Americans, because just for cultural reasons, they tended to do their own things, but other natives, some of them did fight with other men. In particular, it was interesting because Tennessee had a piece of legislation they were calling early on in the war during the Conscription Act that all men could be drafted regardless of color. They had it in Tennessee calling for free men of color to pick up arms. And I actually have here, this is the pamphlet I've gotten from, Fort Delaware is our monument that we have in New Jersey. It's the 2,500 plus men that died there. They're buried in a mass grave. We do actually have several men of color who are buried there and were Confederate veterans. But I had a quote in here that was interesting, and it was from Dr. Lewis Steiner, a member of the U.S. Sanitary Commission who happened to be in Frederick, Maryland, when the Army of Northern Virginia marched on their way to Antietam in September 1862. He noted that, start quote, over 3,000 Negroes must be included in this number. They had arms, rifles, muskets, sabers, bowie knives, dirks, etc. They were supplied in many instances with knapsacks, haversacks, canteens, etc. And they were manifestly an integral part of the Southern Confederacy Army. They were seen riding on horses, mules, driving wagons, riding on caissons and ambulances with the staff of generals, and promiscuously mixed up with all the rebel hordes, end quote.
But let me ask you a question, because I noticed you said must be included. Why did the document make a huge distinction between just like these Negroes, these Black people must be included? Why was it not just people? Why was it not just men, soldiers? Why was the distinction just of Black people? Isn't that not a notification that there was some sort of bias towards like Blackness at the time? Because I just don't see what's the point of the distinction there.
So the point is, and this was an observation by Dr. Lewis Steiner, and he was a member from the Union, because Maryland was a weird state, but he was Union. And in particular, segregation, which is very common up north at that time and persisted for many years. Look at the USA Colored Troops. That was a good example because people often overlook that. This was a group of Black men who typically would dig trenches. They would do the dirty work for the Union. And in particular, what happened was those were led by a white man who was superior. That fact often gets left out by the Republicans that tend to push that, or like the Smithsonian Museum, they don't like cover that at all. And it was interesting because and you'll even see this, which is really sad, but even with Union, for example, in a lot of the burials, like Virginia, for example, we have many Black Confederate veterans that are buried along with white people as well. Up north, that was a different thing. So, for example, in our state,
it's so interesting because even though when Blacks were able to integrate, and I don't even know if you can say integrate, because just about any time in American history, I want to say up until like the early 1900s, even when Black people were integrated, Black men were integrated into these wars, they were not able to fight alongside white individuals. Like, let me pull up a few examples. Are you familiar with the Tuskegee Airmen?
That's right. And it wasn't like Vietnam was like, or I think it was like the first time that they really were, and then the wars following.
My typos, please don't judge me, guys. My typos, I'm sorry. But see, like, look, we're all supposed to be defending the same country, but yeah, we have to be segregated. Okay, remember the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. You see what I'm saying? Like, why? Right. Why? So it's like, yeah, these people got freedoms now, but there's always a stipulation on them. And that's kind of what I'm saying. But I'm truly trying to understand your point, because I understand what you're saying. They can be integrated. They're now allowed to go into these, but it's like the fact that we're saying like they're now allowed to, or now they can be integrated. The fact that we can even say integrated, meaning that prior to that they were not able to go into it. But it was like, okay, I see what you're saying. And the whole point of this podcast is to pretty much figure out the philosophy of the Confederacy. I want to learn the philosophy of the Confederacy, because I do have my own biased opinion, and I'm honest about that, and I'm trying to have an open mind. But when you say things like there's regulations and stipulations in order to get your freedom, or now it was integrated, or now that they were able to do this, that's a clear, like, that verifies that there was racial bias prior to these integrations, and these new freedoms and new liberties. And that leads to my question. So prior to all these freedoms, was the Confederacy truly about freedom and liberty? Was it truly about unifying the South? Because I also have here, like, I remember you bringing up the point that, a lot of people actually bring up this point that, the Confederacy is not about, slavery. It never was. But I remember we were going to talk about this. Where is it at? So like in the Lost Cause, and we can get into this later. But according to Errol Pollard, the Confederacy wasn't about defending slavery. It was defending each state's right to, like, whether or not it was defending each state's right to choose whether or not to allow slavery. So I feel like there's such a rocky argument, because, it's so subjective, because people can take it and be like, oh, the South wasn't about slavery. And I feel like, yes, you can make the argument about it, because even Errol Pollard comes out, and I think he made this like a few years after, shortly after the war had ended, I believe. He says it was defending each state's right to choose whether or not to allow slavery. So it doesn't objectively say that the South or the Confederacy was about defending slavery and slavery like only. It says that it was defending the right for states to choose to whether or not they wanted to, utilize the institution of slavery. But it's like, what is the difference? Like, what is the difference? The fact that you would even consider that like a state, I don't know. That's just me. But Vinny, go ahead, take the floor.
It is. It's a really challenging thing, and it's complex in nature, because what I would also even probably change that to is how you would conduct abolition, because abolition is something that needed to happen, and it needed to happen on a lot of different things. And for example, if you look at New Jersey, that was a union state that they never even did abolition. They were just like slavery all throughout, and then followed by strict segregation. The sad thing about it is that New Jersey, along with several other union states to this day, are states with the highest number of segregation is mostly northern states, which I thought was like mind-boggling.
Right.
And then you would see that, like, with the union being really founded more so on segregation, those are the ideologies that are tended to be hidden from the Republican Party.
Right.
They also hide that some of the early Republicans, because again, as slaves are being freed in the South, there were more freed people of color down in the South compared up north, and that had to do a lot with laws that banned free people from moving up north. You were basically like, you're put in a position, well, what do we do now? And I think this also speaks that as a society, because this is an error I've fallen into many times when I started learning about history, is that I would judge it by today's values. At that time, we didn't have that advanced knowledge that we do now, and things were a lot different. Medical science played a whole role in this.
Right.
A lot of the discriminations in healthcare were based on Northern scientists that would have horrible, and very biased things in medicine.
Right.
And this, just for its time, was the best they had. And as they were able to learn more, society progressed. And they were, maybe in some ways, victims of just the time period. I do know, you'll also hear another women's rights. That's another group of people that were badly impacted too at the time. Women couldn't fight in the war. However, women to an extent did fight in the war. There were women on both sides that would dress up like men and they would go to war. One of them, I forgot her name, but she was a Latina. She fought for the Confederacy and she dressed up as a man, and she actually got arrested because she was dressing up as a man. There was another one who was Belle Boyd, and she was a female who did some things that men did. She was breaking a lot of those gender gaps. One of the most prominent ones was Sally Tompkins. And at that time, they said women could not fight in the war. And what happened was she was America's first female Army officer because she was given full privileges to do her own hospital. And I have the book, I forgot which one, it was either Davis or Stonewall, but I have her autobiography that covered that. She was given those privileges that otherwise the government said you couldn't do that, but she was able to get an override. Right. Overrides did happen during times of war, and that's what we tend to forget. the war taught both sides a lot of different things about ability and where we could come as a nation, maybe. And the period of time that people tend to forget is, people always throw up the lost cause and they'll throw up like Reconstruction. Reconstruction was horrible because people had no rights. If you were a Southerner, you couldn't do anything unless you're a Republican, pretty much.
Right.
The other thing is that there was a period of time that gets left out, and that's reconciliation. And that's when the nation really started to heal.
Mm-hmm.
And it was important because I think a lot of schools leave that out, is how did we heal as a nation from this? Like, we had to come together in some way. And I think that, where we are now is also because we never really remembered the importance of reconciliation, both sides coming together and working for a common good.
Right.
There was still injustice at that time on both sides, Union, South. These were things that we had to overcome as a nation by working together.
I can agree with that. I have no disagreements. That sounds like a logical, what's the word I'm looking for? A logical critique. That's the word, critique on it. But I guess before we move on, we can lastly talk about the lost cause, and then we can get into kind of the modern day stuff, the statues, the education, and all the good stuff.
Absolutely. So the lost cause, from how I view it, a lot of people tend to talk about like the lost cause as an attempt to rewrite history. And I think it's a little complicated because a lot of them don't look at the primary sources. Like, I've read some of the books they would call quote unquote lost cause. One of them was the Truths of History book. And that book was good because it showed actual quotes from historical sources, primary sources at that time. And again, another place that we had to come as a society is a lot of education originally was based in Christian foundations. For the most part now, a lot of education is based in, I guess, more so science. And that was a thing that people tend to forget when you're reading sources, is it may come across as a little odd. The one thing that is interesting with what people will call the lost cause is they would say, oh, well, the Black Confederates were a lie. What I have here is a brief profile on just 3 of New Jersey's Black Confederate veterans who were buried in the mass grave. And
wait, let me ask you a question, because I should have asked that. Okay, so let's say, so I'm going to play devil's advocate. Black people were not just joining the Confederate, like the army, just to get freedom. They truly they wanted to. So this is hypothetical. My question that leads into that. Okay, what would be like at the time? Why would a Black person want to join the army? Why would the Black person want to become a member of the Confederacy, considering the fact, not even just in the South, because even you admitted this, slavery is a nationwide thing across the entire country. Like, so it's like universally known that if you have a certain skin color, that you are to be labeled a certain kind of way. With that alone, with that fact, like being on the table alone, like, why would anybody who's Black want to join the Confederacy? Why would anybody want to fight any army in this country when you don't even have rights outside of a piece of land, where you're labeled as a piece of property? So my question is, why would any Black person want to join the Confederacy?
Absolutely. So there were, and people also forget this. So slavery, I don't know if you knew this, the first slave trader in the United States was actually a Black man, and it was Anthony Johnson. He was the first slave trader in America. There also were Black slave owners. So there were.
But a lot of people also don't tell you that Anthony Johnson was also a former slave too. That's the thing. He was the first African-American slave in this country because he was from Angola, actually. And I believe he went to the Jamestown, Virginia courts to get the rights to become a slave owner. But people always leave out the fact, because they like to bring that up. First African-American slave owner. He was also a slave before he was a slave owner. So with that being said, your point being?
So basically, if you look at how the South was structured, both in the armies and in the area, it was a little bit more integrated than the North. So while the North was banning people of color from moving in, you had this land. And basically, if you were fighting for the South, freedom was coming regardless, because General Lee, who was a Christian, was not for slavery at all. And that would have been a man that would have he was actively speaking out against it. You also had Stonewall Jackson, who was not pro-slavery, and you had General Forrest, who freed slaves. So slavery was on its way out at the time, as agriculture was also being revolutionized by more technologies. If the South was successful in being 2 separate countries, what it probably would have looked like would have been, you would have had more stricter segregation laws up north, and that would have been addressed at a later time. So technically there would have been some freedom there, more of a thing. You also got paid. People forget about this. The many men of color that fought for the Confederacy, if they were a musician or a cook, those positions, you got paid a lot more compared to the Union counterparts. You also got
soldiers
pensions.
also got cheaper guns, outdated guns, while all the other white soldiers got updated guns and better uniforms. I read a book. Damn, what was the name of the book? I can't even remember. But basically, there was a black Confederate soldier who was talking about. I forgot his name, but he was talking about how, he was fighting for his freedom and he was willing to fight, the war, to succeed and stuff. And he opposed of Lincoln and all of that, but he was talking about how, you know, we didn't get the same equipment, we didn't get the same, essentials that our white counterparts got, but we pretty much had to work with what we got. But you kind of see that every time, in a lot of like these wars where you see a lot of racial segregation, because even like in the Tuskegee, the airmen, that whole event in history, they got older planes, they got older guns, they got older uniforms. They didn't get all the updated equipment, the upgraded military weaponry, they always got the hand-me-down stuff, So I don't know. This is all like new to me, discovering this and kind of trying to analyze and maneuver through this.
It could also be because of the blockade.
What'd you say?
So it could also be because that's another challenging part, is different regiments got different things, but you also got to remember what really ultimately led to the South's demise, and people don't know this, is the Anaconda blockade. Basically the idea that if you fully surround the nation and you cut off all imports, all exports,
right,
that the nation will starve to death, and that weakens them. That's kind of where we were at, because we didn't have the ability at that point to manufacture stuff. Most of the manufactured goods were up north. So you had to quickly find ways to manufacture and make do with stuff. So certain regiments were better off than others, and it could have just been maybe that regiment had certain things or whatnot. If you were lucky, you were able to get resources from certain things in the railway,
right.
But you were given a very fixed amount of stuff and a small amount of resources. And that kind of went across the board. Shoes, for example, those are something, if they wore out, you were wearing barefooted everywhere.
Right.
And I think that's the thing that people forget about, is that your country was basically blockaded everywhere. And they even have like Christmas times, they would say stuff like, oh, the Yankee shot Santa. And Christmas at that point became more about the true family values instead of the material. I have the Confederate cookbook, which actually talks about how foods were made back then. And everyone, regardless of skin color, because people would also throw up Andersonville, like, oh, how about they were treated in Andersonville? Well, I explained. There was prisoner exchange happening in both the Union and Confederacy. However, Lincoln put a stop to that to further make the blockade more impactful. The Union troops that were stuck in Andersonville, they were given what little rations the Southerners had, and that was pretty much, you were eating what you had, and that was little. So in a sense, Lincoln kind of allowed them to starve in that position. Much like up north, the Union prisons had a lot of the resources, and they stripped the men of their clothes. A lot of them had to sleep out in the cold, froze to death. Some of them got diseases. All these northern prisons, after this stuff happened, they pretty much demolished the prison. And then we had to fight after the war to honor what happened there. And we're still fighting that battle today, to an extent.
Interesting. Okay. So I also kind of want to step away from, because I had enough of my race questions, because of course I think most people questions are rooted in race when it comes to the Confederacy. But before we move on to like the education and all this stuff, because I believe this goes into that, help me understand, what is the philosophy of the Confederacy? I understand that they wanted to secede and have their own sovereignty, and they didn't kind of, they did not want to conform to, Abe Lincoln's law, Abe Lincoln's commands, so many other things that the northern region was demanding, or like the Union states, as I should call them. Outside of slavery, what's the philosophy of the Confederacy? What's the point? What does the Confederacy support? What is the origins? Where does it derive? Like, I want to know the philosophies, not the politics of it, but does the question make sense?
Yes. So basically the main idea of, I always view it as no taxation without representation. It was a lot of the similar values of the 13 colonies. And I always say that comes across in that First National, that when you see that, the Georgia flag, basically another example of that, that's basically the First National, 13 stars, same foundations. And really, from the constitutional perspective, when the government is too out of control, you have that right to break away and form your own government. Right. Governments evolve. Like, our government today has came so far than even like 20 years ago. So you had the foundations of an early government. And was the Confederacy perfect? Absolutely not. I think there was more things that I'd like to add in there. if we had our own Confederacy today, I'd want to add, issues that are important to me, like medical freedom. That's a very important issue. Medical autonomy, you know, education reform, things like that are important. So I do believe that the Confederacy was also based on individualism, based on states to be more individualized instead of just everything uniform, because you lose that individuality. So, for example, if you look at states today, you have federal laws, let's say on texting and driving. That's another example. Certain states allow that, others don't. There's now a push to make it all across the board. Should we ban it completely? And I always come from that point of view that on certain issues, I think it's important for states to decide what they want to do, because when you start getting in that union-like idea that, the federal government has to be across the board, that's dangerous thinking. On that same note, a lot of people try to deny that there was a party switch. I know, people often cite Candace Owens' book, which denies it, which has some flaws in it. That I read it.
Blackout, I've read it twice.
There's flaws in it.
Don't get me wrong, I think Candace, she did what she could, but the way she praised Republicans in it as if they were better than Democrats. I mean, the way she condemned Democrats as if, I don't know, she held Republicans to this standard as if, like they
it's
were
a false
God.
Standard.
And it's like, I don't know, but there's a lot of flaws in her book, but carry on. I'm sorry, but yeah.
And there is a book, Lachlan Seabrook. I talked about it on Monuments Across Dixie, but it was Lincoln was a liberal, Jefferson Davis was a conservative, and it talks about those ideologies, how the parties kind of switched. The other thing that really complicates a lot of these matters is that the early Republican Party was very pro big government. It was very, pro things across the board. And we talk about this idea of independence and, being able to have states' rights. I think what's going on now is a prime example with that whole court case, but also on a broader level, another issue with that would have been the mask and vaccine mandate. Originally, you had the left saying that we need every single state to implement a mask mandate and a vaccine mandate. Where I came from is, okay, well, then let's let the states decide. Then we had certain states like Florida that said, okay, we're not going to follow a mask and vaccine mandate. We're going to do things differently.
Wait, I have a good question, because I actually support a lot of what you're saying, because that's actually I think America, I think you know this, I'm pretty much an anarchist, like an anarcho-libertarian, pretty much. I hate government entirely, but you know that already. But I would actually support if America would return to federalism. Like, I actually don't oppose of what, the whole Roe v. Wade being overturned, because people just don't understand what's going on. They just hear like mainstream media fear mongering and stuff like, oh, they're trying to take away our access to abortions and rights and stuff. No, nobody's doing that. What they're saying is that they're going to, separate the powers and give Roe v. Wade back to the states and leave the power to the people. So if you want to live in a state that's pro-choice, now you have a bunch of options. If you want to live in a state that's pro-life, now you have a bunch of options. But my question is, say we do have a system, like let's say if we were back during the Confederacy, and we do have a system sort of like federalism, and we have people like Davison and Stevens that believe that states should have their own powers to constitute laws as they see fit, come up with their own constitutions, governments, and they should be able to do what they want when they want. But my question is, even in terms of slavery or, things like that, what if somebody in the state, like in a state of federalism, did not no longer want to be a slave, but because they were in a state that supported slavery and they had to be a slave legally because it was constituted by the law set by that state, how does that work under federalism? What does the rights come in for that individual? Because I also think that people tend to forget, like you brought up the point also, yes, a lot of these men were slave owners, but they also freed their slaves at the end. But that kind of doesn't, I don't even want to say it doesn't sit right with me. I just kind of don't care, because the fact that you own slaves to begin with, I don't know, people wouldn't say that, with Hitler, oh, he was very harsh in the beginning, but, he felt bad because I believe he committed suicide, I believe. And, I don't know if that's true, but I have read it somewhere. But even if it is, they say, oh, well, he obviously felt bad. He felt guilty. So, obviously he should be redeemed for it because, he killed himself. Is that a reason to, justify the egregious acts that he committed? I don't know, I try to figure out what's the difference between saying oh yeah, they used to be slave owners but now they're not slave owners anymore. I don't get the point of that. But back to my question, what would federalism look like for a slave? How would that work for individual rights?
More than likely, because there would have been a push that, the deadlines, and it would have been like hard deadlines that, okay, by this point, you must reduce slavery by this amount, and then you must also help with like housing or something like that, because you needed to get property was a big one. These are all things that were basically trying to be enacted.
Right.
I have to read the document before Jefferson Davis got arrested that would have most likely have got the ball rolling on this. You would have had some assistance programs would have been needed as well. I know they tried doing the Freedmen's Bureau under the Union, and that was a massive failure for different reasons. But I know another big thing is, I think it's important to realize that while slavery was wrong, there were also laws in place. So, for example, you had to have money to basically have slaves, and that's why a lot of the population didn't own them. You had to pay for medical care, you had to pay for food and all that, because if you had someone who was malnourished or who was diseased, they weren't doing the work on the property. Now, you probably would have had to do a system in place where you had to start paying them, and that would have been, I guess, more of like what came after, which is sharecropping, and that evolved into something later on. But I do think that. So, for example, as an Afro-Puerto Rican, we look back in my family tree and we have, I think, one or two ancestors.
Did you call yourself an Afro-Puerto Rican?
Mm-hmm.
What's the Afro side?
The Afro side is West African. So, and it actually came across in the DNA stuff, which was interesting. So, Puerto Rican.
Are you sure you're not pulling an Elizabeth Warren card on me right now?
No, I'm not doing Elizabeth Warren. According to the census, we looked at back in Puerto Rico. What is it, the 1%? No, it's more than that. It's
So what did you primarily identify as? Because I know you said that you're Native American, I know you say that you're Puerto Rican, and now you say you're West African.
I say Latino because it kind of just blends everything in there, because Puerto Rican is already really interesting as a culture. It's a mix of things. It's European, it is African, and it is Native Puerto Rican, which the Tejanos, they don't exist anymore. They were basically wiped. But we do things a little bit differently in Puerto Rico. We're able to honor the good, the bad, and the ugly of history and accept it for what it is and not cancel one another. And I think that's the beauty of Puerto Rico. So we have monuments in Puerto Rico, people that may have owned my ancestor at some point, because we had two ancestors that they were identified in the census as being what they worded as Negro, and that was Black. And a lot of times people forget that Puerto Rico, they had slavery. I think it was until the very late 1800s, way longer than the USA. And
oh yeah, and that's a good point too, because like I know people like, why is he asking all these race questions and stuff? Like I said, these are my questions, these are my podcast. This is my podcast. You don't like it, keep it pushing. But anyway, people tend to forget that not only, like, people try to put the blame on white people all the time. White people were not the only ones that owned slaves. People tend to forget that even Native Americans owned Black slaves. Black people owned Black slaves, and
Asians.
Asians. I mean, Indians too. So I mean, it's a universal thing. But people, I don't know. I do have to agree that there is a big anti-white culture that we have going on. So
they promote the white slave owner. But for example, are you familiar with the Siamese twins? Or probably not the correct term, but they would call conjoined twins. They were the Asian.
Dr. Ben Carson, is that what you're talking about?
No, well, the similar concept. It was twins that were conjoined.
Oh, just generally, okay, a concept. Okay, yeah.
So there were the famous ones. I call them the Siamese twins. Ripley's talks about them. They were from North Carolina and they were from China. They were Asian slave owners, and people forget that.
I did not know that.
Mm-hmm.
So the twins were slave owners.
Yes.
Okay, that's interesting to know. But I guess before we move on, because I know I want to end it shortly, we're going to talk about the statue part, and of course education and what we can do better to give proper representation to your beliefs. But did you want to finish anything off on the last note of what we were just talking about, or want to move on?
That pretty much covered it. I know that I'll probably be doing a talk on, I guess, my own thing, but tomorrow I am going to be honoring the 3 men of color that we found that are buried at Fort Delaware, bringing awareness to that, kind of humanizing the monument, because it was a horrible time where everyone who was at Fort Delaware was buried in the same grave. And I think that really kind of highlights it, that, we're all equal. And this is something that always tends to get forgotten about. And it's important to talk about when you have these discussions. I know that in Delaware, and I went there, I learned a lot about what went on there. And
hold on, you think, really quickly though, you really think we're all equal? You think?
I do believe in equality. I do.
I don't. Why?
In the terms of so for the most part, you have the same opportunities. And granted, there were times because I have family members that disagree with me on this on the Latino side, and that's what's been causing a rift lately. But basically, I don't think that, I'm any better than anyone else. I think that I have every opportunity out there compared to someone who is, white.
Hmm. Okay, so my critique would be on that. There's so many reasons, but the reason I don't believe equality can exist and the reason I don't think that we're all equal, for example, everybody can be given the same opportunities, but humans always equate a person's value and worth to everything that they do. You are of value, of high value, if you are, for example, a president, a person that holds a degree, or a doctor, lawyer, engineer, a slave owner, somebody who drew up the Constitution, or if you're a founding father, all those crazy things, or the first woman to do this. You are not equal, and you don't have equality if you are a slave, or a low minimum wage worker, or somebody who doesn't have a college degree, or that just naturally throughout history we always see how it doesn't matter race, culture, religion. We always base people in what they have, and what, like, even like when it comes to religion, what values you have, the belief system, the amount of money you have, what kind of car you drive. No matter what, throughout history, we always see social hierarchies being created. Social hierarchies is the reason that I do not believe that equality can never exist, because even animals do it. I mean, you see lions and their pride and stuff, and obviously the lion is followed the king, the lion and stuff, because he's the alpha male. He's the one that protects the pack. He's of higher value. They follow him. He leads them. I mean, leads the female lioness. But we see social hierarchies. We see classism rooted. It's intrinsic within our biological nature. So that's one of the first reasons why I don't believe that equality can never exist, or we're all the same, because we're not all the same. I mean, for example, we can even look at like skin, for example, not even in terms of racism. Like, you're lighter than me, I'm darker than you. It's a privilege to be this dark sometimes, because I don't get sunburned as easy. My, over-concentrated melanin protects me from the sun, versus I'm almost sure that you probably would get sunburned.
I get dark.
Yeah.
If you see me in the summer, people think I'm actually a different ethnicity. People think I'm Indian. If I get like super, super dark, it's interesting.
Yeah, not even just that. Like, you're taller than me. I'm 5'6". How tall are you?
I'm like 5'7".
Oh, well, not that much taller, but even still, it's a bit taller. In society today, we equate height to value. So, I mean, the more you have, or, if people choose what's of value, but, we can never, ever be the same, because we're all born with differences. We all have differences. But I don't think equality can exist, because even in terms of equality, in order to create equality, you have to essentially create oppression. You can only create equality by suppressing other privileges. If you deem another person or another group underprivileged and like not equal, and you see another party that has something more, or an abundance of something, in order to create that equality, you have to take away from them. So I just don't believe in the whole we're all the same. I feel like it's like oblivious, and I just feel like it's over optimistic. And not saying you, but people have that idea like we're not equal. Equality doesn't exist. It can never exist, because, like I said, in order to create equality, you have to create oppression. People don't want to realize that. That's a sad truth. But carry on. It's just me and my little rant about equality. But
I would, and no, I do, to an extent, I agree. And I think I probably should have worded it more of like celebrating the individual characteristics that make us important, because, our individuality is also a strength. And I also use the example, like you brought up a good point in education. People put so much credit and meaning behind a degree. And I hate to even word it like this, but there are, for the most part, certain degrees that are meaningless. And also, but then the people with those degrees are held to a higher standard. They're the authors that are writing these books that get, valued as truth.
yeah, like
I
gender
believe
studies, yeah.
Oh, exactly. Or
Because
there's a happiness one now they're
because
doing. It's a
politics,
happiness degree.
yeah, because politics, and that's why I said people choose what's of value. Is a gender study degree actually of value? Hell no. I'm a
You
bio
can't do nothing.
Yeah, I'm a biochemistry student studying to become a doctor. You say you're a psychologist.
Clinical psych. So it'll be like
Yeah.
you get a license with that, and it's a license that really opens doors.
We both we're both in majors as students that specialize in something that can actually contribute to something. Conduct research, become doctors, just do anything. what is a gender studies degree doing for anybody? Like, let's really be honest. What is it doing?
Trade does more than that. And I tell people trades are just as important, because if you think about it, like even I came from a trade background as a hairdresser, and I actually was making a lot more than some of the people that started out in the field when it started, because when you get to know how that science works, because there's science behind it, when you're able to, train properly. And again,
Right.
the way that we do that trade in New Jersey, and I guess for most states is not done correctly, but every state has the right to do it differently. Some do it better than others. I believe more in an apprenticeship, because that would teach you the business skills instead of paying an arm and a leg to basically recite a book. And that's how they do it here. Pass your test, and the test is 30 years outdated, which doesn't teach anything. So you have a high burnout rate, but there is a potential to make a lot of money and be a very successful business owner if you play your cards right. And I think that's important to know. And, growing up, they put so much on like, you got to study the books. The books are important, but I'm like, but the trade is also important, because that gives you a different set of skills.
And see, that's why, and I love academia, I do, but I also hate college. It's really weird because one minute I like college, one minute I don't. I'm a junior currently going into my senior year, but college is a big scam. I think we're all starting to realize that, but I can't become a medical doctor. I can't become a researcher until, it's about money. That's all it's about. But, the reason people would, equate a gender study degree, of more like worth more value than like an engineering degree or a medical degree or something is because propaganda. I mean, politics. Even John D. Rockefeller even said, why have a nation full of workers when I can have a nation full of slaves? If you can send a bunch of teachers to school and teach students about, 1,000, like there's more than just male and female. There's this indoctrinate people, make them feel like these left-wing liberal rats, part of a political race, and collect their votes generation after generation. Everybody is voting for Democratic Party because everybody feels like, oh, I'm he, they, them, Z, this, that, this is my gender, all this trans this and trans that, and women are oppressed, and Black people are oppressed and Hispanics are oppressed, everything. There's a duality to everything, but like there is no significance in a gender studies degree. And I just find it sad that people in society actually think that a gender studies degree is of more value than like a medical degree or engineering degree, considering the fact that you wouldn't even be alive if it wasn't for that doctor with that medical degree. How could you even go study to get that gender studies degree if it wasn't for that doctor with that medical degree? But it's
that even segues, because the gender studies degree, I call it the cancel culture degree. It's basically a lot of what we're dealing with now does get taught in that class, because basically for psychology, my one college, they made us do a gender studies class, and it was very painful to go through. You had to basically write to what the teacher wanted. And a lot of those themes that we had in 2017 were themes that were brought up like, years down the line, like 2020, that a lot of these themes that were being taught or more like indoctrinated with. I'm like, this is a little interesting. And for example, you'll have gender studies that their goal is to eliminate gender from everything. There are differences in sex and gender, but it doesn't mean that anyone's better than anyone. It means that, men can do certain things like, for certain sports. And that's a topic for a whole other day. But basically, one that came up was our language. So I don't know if you know any Spanish. Spanish is a gender specific language, particularly with an emphasis on men. So you could have a whole football stadium filled with men, but if you have, you can have a whole football stadium filled with women, but if there's one man, it would still be called hermanos, meaning like you guys.
Usually I found out that in Spanish, in terms of Spanish, if it ends with an O, it's usually mutually exclusive to male or man. Or if it
and they want to change it to Latinx.
Yeah. And that's so stupid to me.
That's changing a language, which is so disrespectful. And that's like almost attacking a culture, because that is how the language is structured. Like rosa is like rose, or also means pink. They want to call it rosa.
I'm telling you, they want to change the entire like grammatical standard. They want to change English. They want to change all language structure. Like they want to change the systems that people have been using for centuries just to fit Western political agenda. Like, why is it okay? And after we say this, we should get back on topic because we kind of got off course. But
you also mentioned something real quick before I forget, is you mentioned Rockefeller. I don't know if you knew this, but I do not know enough about the history. I only know probably like this much. I'm still trying to learn more and more because there's so much to study. But the Rockefellers is something I just learned recently. They actually donated that big money to the Union and to Lincoln. They funded a decent amount of that. So I want to go down that rabbit hole and learn more about that. Another important thing to remember is that Lincoln, believe it or not, because I know you'll have the Republicans that throw up socialism all the time. It becomes like their talking point. Lincoln was a socialist. There is no denying that. He was not only friends with Karl Marx and wrote him, He wrote a book, and you can purchase the book on Amazon. And it's called Sermons and Socialism by Lincoln. Lincoln was also celebrated at the turn of the century. The book that's in, I'm blanking on the name of the book, and I'm sorry for that. But if you go on SCV Chat, we have it on Facebook and we have it on YouTube. They have different episodes and different topics. Look for the one that talked about Lincoln and the book, because they try to review a book a month or something, and they'll analyze the book and break it down. And the book that covered, I think it was like The Real Lincoln or something. Actually, wait a minute, I do have the book. The book covers how Lincoln is actually valued by socialists.
You said, wait a minute, I do have the book.
I do have the book. I forgot I have audio on the way to Virginia. So for Lee Jackson Day, I always play an audiobook, and that's
Wait, could you show us the book? Do you have it? Because I want to get it too. I'm
sure. And it's right here. It is.
Oh, what is it called? I didn't hear you. Just give me the title.
Let me pause it. And it's the problem with Lincoln.
Okay, The Problem with Lincoln. Who's the author?
Is Thomas J. DiLorenzo with a D-I.
Okay. We should move on though, but fun fact, because I think this should be, this is so fascinating to me. Believe it or not, guys, he does hair for a living. Isn't that cool?
I love it. It is one of the best and rewarding careers, and also skincare, because skincare, you're doing basically things that a nurse would do. And it's that gray area in like what we do in our field. Because there is a gray area as, technologies are progressing. What can we do legally? What can't we do legally? And there is money to be made in both of those things.
I have seen it all. A son of the Confederacy, been a hairdresser. I have seen it all. There is nothing I have not seen. But yeah, we should move on. And this is pretty much kind of off the, what is this called? Presentation slide right now. It's getting late. I think we're both getting tired because I'm starting to forget my words, but we'll keep this brief and short. But basically, lastly, I want to talk about how I think, this podcast is a prime example of the misrepresentation that the Confederacy is getting. And I don't say that to be against, and I don't say that to be in support, because like I said, even after this podcast, I learned so much, but I think it's clear that there's a lot that I do not know about, because, they don't teach it. They do not teach it in school. I only use and I utilize the resources that were given to me in the education that I was given. But I think that, what would you say about what would be the first step to properly represent the Confederacy? How would you like to see it been represented, like in schools and in curriculum? Like, I don't know, what is the first step to properly represent the Confederacy in education?
So I would think that the first thing would be to basically teach the full truth about the flags, because that's where the first error gets started. A lot of the times when they started doing that flag debate in classrooms, there's that like one viral video. The one person that was trying to refute a lot of the facts was referring to that flag being the only Confederate flag, or the official Confederate flag, when it was only the first. And then that was actually the last. So it's an important to maybe just do a little flag science, maybe do a little bit about who did what. Also, like when we studied the Civil War in school, on a good day, you're maybe getting like 2 days in high school, and that's it. That's what's mandated, at least in my state. And you cover it a little bit in 8th grade. They don't really go in detail. But now what they're doing is they're saying, well, the war was about slavery, the Union were the good guys, Lincoln was an emancipator, and they leave it with that. And those give people a lot of false facts. Like, people are now coming after Robert E. Lee, like his monument, which I actually wrote the price down. The schools are also getting involved in that area, and I've witnessed that several times, where they'll be trying to get students to push for the removal of monuments. Monument removal actually comes at taxpayer dollars expenses, and all that money could actually be put back into the town for different things like programs.
And I just want to cut in, that's just a scam, because why the hell is it costing tax dollars to remove a statue? It's just a big scam. Like, why?
It's a huge one. Anything? And it's a legal one, because that one monument of General Lee, which was illegally removed and actually is now going to the Supreme Court, which is a current case. There was a woman, she was on that case for years. she died at 98, trying to, she was around 98, she was in her 90s, trying to litigate that. And it costed them over $2.17 million to remove General Lee, which they could have airlifted. Instead, they chose to cut it up into 3 pieces, so it never would get put back up. In particular, that monument was fully destroyed, the base. All the monuments in Monument Avenue were.
Imagine spending that much to chop down a statue that didn't even cost that much to put up.
That's right. It was a lot cheaper to put up.
I'm speechless. I don't know what to say. I'm so
and
tired.
Booker T. Washington, he did support. I think he even donated and supported one of the monuments. I have to look back at the notes on that, but he was someone who was for the monuments on reconciliation, which was healing the nation, how monuments help to heal, because monuments, there's a false narrative they went up during times of oppression, and that wasn't true. What happened was they went up. You'll see most monuments after a war, they go up 25 years, 50 years, 75 years, and 100 years. Well, the 1960s was marking that 100th anniversary of the war between the states that happened, the Civil War. Also, the fact that a lot of people did not have money immediately after the war to erect monuments on both sides. And what happened during reconciliation was something interesting. You saw people helping both sides put up monuments, Union helping Confederate, Confederate helping Union. We have a monument up here in New Jersey. It is the same as a monument down south, a Confederate monument. The only thing that's different is the belt, and that's it.
Yeah, and I think I also want to say this because I think it plays on both sides. Like, first of all, I want to say this. I don't think these statues should be removed. Do I agree with everything Robert E. Lee did? Hell no, I do not. But it should not be removed because, like I said, history is a big thing. We should all learn from it. But it's already up. Why spend all that money to destroy it? But it's like, people are so sensitive. What did you get out of removing it? Like, if I saw a statue of Hitler, that was put up, I would want it to stay up. I do. I would want it to stay up because that's education. That is history. That teaches us, it's a reminder as to what we should not do. Because Hitler was, he didn't do, things that benefited, humanity. He did things that caused detriment to humanity. And I think the evidence is there. But, destroying, they want to just destroy all the evidence like it didn't happen. So what? You can push your agenda up to the front, and, I don't agree with that. But there's also another side, because there's statues that I would like to see up, national statues of like Marcus Garvey. I would like to see Bobby Seale, Malcolm X, Maya Angelou. But you have a lot of people who, who are conservative or tend to be on the right side of politics who say, why would you put a statue up of, Malcolm X? He was like anti-white and stuff. Malcolm X was not anti-white. He was very proud of his beliefs, just like Robert E. Lee and Jefferson
Misunderstood.
David. So it's like, it plays for both sides. If I'm not going to tear down a statue, if you want a statue of Hitler up because you want to feel proud about it, go ahead. If you want a statue of Robert E. Lee up because you want to feel proud about it, go ahead. But I also want a statue of Malcolm X up. I also want a statue of Marcus Garvey up. But, people always have an issue of who can get a statue. It's all about politics because, like I said, these are pieces of art that provoke emotion. People use these things as symbolism. People use these things as tokens of nationalism, supremacy. But I think in order to create the balance, I think everybody deserves some form of representation in their beliefs. I think the issue becomes if we start the statues and the artwork and blah, blah, blah can be put up. The issue becomes is when people start to take these statues and do egregious acts with them, actually trying to oppress people, well, the statue of Hitler is up. Now that must mean I can go back and reoppress Jews. No, it does not mean that. It's not there for that purpose. But I think it becomes an issue when people actually take initiatives to commit the same actions that these people did. But, that's another debate for another day. But you were talking about representation of the Confederacy in education.
I agree with you on that. And I actually would like to see that. That was actually my one goal. And a lot of people had that same goal for Monument Avenue. It's called Monument Avenue. You can put up a monument wherever you want. I would love to see a monument of Malcolm X next to General Lee, or maybe do another, like
it's American history. Yeah,
it is. You can have a whole nice monument. And Monument Avenue, and here's the sad part. This is what breaks my heart, is because Richmond had the potential to make so much profits off of this. Add more monuments instead of destroying and removing. Add more monuments. It would increase revenue. You get money for the town because when people would come to travel, they would support the business. What they did now to Monument Avenue was they've destroyed everything. And it was really shocking because when people were saying all the time, put stuff in museums, there was several museums that were attacked. We lost a historic battle flag. We had a blockade runner that was burned to a crisp because someone Molotov cocktailed it. When you do that, you basically make the town look like it's not safe. That mayor that was in Richmond, he dropped the ball on the safety big time. The governor that tolerated that let mob rule, and what their end result was that crime in Richmond is through the roof. People don't want to move there. People are moving out in droves, and the tourism is not coming in. And what happened was when they spent $2.17 million to do that to General Lee, they could have put that money toward floodgates, because I don't know if you know what happened, but shortly after removing it, there was a massive flood that also damaged Richmond badly. Because the floodgates were outdated. And it's important to realize that monuments have the potential to be incredible for revenue. You can create whole events around it, generate revenue for the city. When we do our services, they're for memorial, for remembrance. Some of the monuments are for greatness.
My only requirement for that would be if they're going to put these statues up, because they always put little plaques, but I notice every time I go to a museum or something, they leave a significant portion. I mean, the statue would be like 20 feet tall, and it would be enough to put entire autobiography on it, and they only put like a little tiny plaque. I think the issue is people are also upset at the fact that when these statues are put up in place, did Jefferson Davis own slaves? Of course he did. That should be included on the plaque. But it should also be, what also should be included on the plaque was the stuff that he tried to do at the end of the war, towards the end. People do change, and I'm not arguing that he changed or he didn't change. It's, people like to try to twist my rhetoric sometimes, but what I'm saying is, how can we ever learn anything if we're only teaching part history? And I think like that goes into this representation for the Confederacy in education. They only teach it as it's racist. It was anti-Black. It was pro-slavery. It was anti-woman. It was about white nationalism or white supremacy. This is, a lot of people believe that the Confederacy helped, uproot the Klan, give them a platform. But even if that is true, I don't, why are we not teaching the other side of it too? Because we have both acknowledged that there were some good people who, were in, the Confederacy. I may not agree with the philosophies, the overall framework of the Confederacy, but I can't just negate some of the facts. There were some good people within the Confederacy. That's an objective fact.
Here's the interesting thing too, that you brought up a really good point on that one horrible group. So originally when that group started, it was more of a group that was fighting against martial law, and then it was quickly disbanded. The problem with that group is when it came back with a vengeance, it was the second wave when it was at its most deadly, and they often misused the USA flag. Their most famous march when they marched in DC was all the USA flags everywhere. And it wasn't until that finally, died out that the third wave came, which is the wave that we're dealing with today, which thankfully, according to numbers, are shrinking. That you see misrepresentation of not just our flag, but the Betsy Ross, the Gadsden flag. And I think it's also important for people to know that any group can misuse a flag for bad purposes. If you look at how some people, for example, some people will use Trump and they'll promote him as a cult, and they have misused the USA flag. There have been people in that movement to the extreme that have misused other flags as well. Gadsden flag, USA flag. I saw a post, it was a left-wing site, and they said, is it time to change the USA flag, or is its narrative changing because a group misuses it? And it's important to know that while I wish I can, patent our flags and say that if you use them for the wrong purpose, we revoke the right to pull them away, as much as I want, I can't do that.
I wanted to pull that up too, because I have some images right here. I probably can't show it on the screen. Maybe I can. Okay, I'll just talk about it. So remember when Charlottesville had occurred during when Trump, all this stuff? And remember, you had all the people out there with the Nazi flags, and you had them out there with the Confederate flags, and they were like, "Oh, white power must make a comeback. This is a white man's world and white supremacy." And
totally disgusting.
They had the Confederate flag. So when people, I think also that's the thing too, because you obviously a supporter of the Confederacy, you obviously don't hold those beliefs. But when you see people that hold those beliefs, like Black people are inferior and white nationalism must make a comeback, when you see Charlottesville, and like Trump said, there were good people on both sides, because you did have what was going on protesters there. You did have people on the opposite side. You have to be an idiot to negate that. I mean, it's literally on all over the internet. Wow, how could you, I don't understand. But for those people that do use the Confederate flag to promote white nationalism, to promote racial hatred, and talk about, what's your opinion on that? Because people do use the Confederate flag to inflate racism. That's very true.
They have used our flags, they've used the USA flag. And what I want to say directly to those people that misuse any of our flags, whether it's the Confederate flag, whether it's the American flag, USA flag, whether it's a Gadsden flag, Betsy Ross, find your own flag and get the hell out of our country, because there's no room for that here. And to be honest, if it wasn't for the violence risk, because honestly, if there is a violent protest coming, my one thing is that we don't want no part in it. And there was actually statements that were made when stuff was happening with the monuments, that the SCV would say, don't go out there, especially if there's a violent group going to be out there. The last thing you want is more conflict. We don't want conflict. We want our monuments to be safe. And we're telling those that are coming with hateful stuff, you don't have any place here. You don't belong in the SCV. You don't deserve the right to fly those flags.
Well, I do have a good question, because I think this kind of, I don't know why I didn't ask this like 10 minutes ago or 20 minutes ago when we were talking about it. But you know how people associate racism with the Confederate flag, and you said, you kind of understand the duality of it, both sides. Why do you think those people, when you take the flag, you don't see what they see? But why do you think those people take that flag, the same flag that you support, and why do they have a different ideology? Why do they have a different perception of race and politics? Where does that come from? Does the flag give them that belief? Or I don't know. Where do you think the racism comes from when those people use racism and the Confederate flag as simultaneously? Where do you think that comes from?
I think a lot of it comes from misrepresentation from the media. So, for example, on both sides, there's people on Fox News that are horrible, and there's people on CNN that are horrible that will not fully talk about the truth. You will never see somebody from the SCV that will go on Fox News and explain, or even CNN, and say, hey, these are our flags. These are what they mean. They do not stand for these horrible things that people think they do. You also see a lot of media that will falsely portray stuff like, not like news, but reality shows or soap operas. They have portrayed our flags negatively too, which has done an impact. They also leave out like a lot of stuff. Like our organization, for example, I forgot the guy's name. He was one of our commanders. He took a stand against any kind of racism. I have to get more information on him, but it was brought up at our last SCV chat group broadcast, which is public. Anyone can watch the SCV chat. And I think talking about him will be incredible because it will dispel a lot of those myths that exist. We even have another lady, and her presentation, she'd be another good person for you to talk to, is Sheila Randolph, and she does a presentation called The Unlikely Freedom Rider, and it was about how Robert E. Lee's daughter, Mary Custis Lee, she did something similar to what Rosa Parks did, where she was in a train car, and what happened was in Virginia, they tried to do segregation, and Virginia tried to fight it. What happened was certain towns did segregation, so she was riding a train car, and she refused to sit in the white only section. She got up and she went back to what they would call the colored section, and she says, I'm not leaving, I'm staying here. They threatened to arrest her. And this whole thing became an issue because she was trying to take a stand for social justice and say, this is wrong. Why are we doing this? Why are we having this?
I didn't know that. I would like you to send that to me after this too. I want to.
It's a whole video. And I was like, my jaw hit the floor last night. I just saw this.
Also, you just learned about this.
Just yesterday on Cinco de Mayo, when I was enjoying tamales, and I think it was tamales and Jack Daniels, which is a really good combo. I was supposed to go to an event. The event was canceled. So I'm like, all right, I'm just going to party at home. And I saw this and I'm like, this is really, really interesting. And these stories are what needs to be elevated and talked about because it really breaks, like what your podcast, Breaking the Monolith, it breaks that idea of thought because you won't ever hear this on the Republican side. You won't ever hear this on the liberal side. And the problem is people try to make this a political issue instead of just a regular history issue and telling it like it is.
That's what I'm saying. That's why I don't support, Democrat, Republican. It's all a scam, this whole
it's a big scam.
Inflated social democracy, in some terms do I support, in terms of seceding and individualism and federalism in terms of the Confederacy, do I support it? Yes, I do. I think I do. I think we need to make a return to federalism. I think we need to, give sovereign power back to the states. I think we need to just stop trying to have an entire federal government that regulates every issue and should try to create these one-size-fits-all solutions. But, I think people would live life much happier and in peace if we stop politicizing everything. We give power back to the states. And essentially, I kind of want a stateless society, but I think humanity is too scared for that. And I don't think they're prepared for it. But
I would agree with you. And it's like, it's these important things, like these conversations are important and more of them have to happen. You'll never see this because the way our country is so divided, you will never see that on Fox News. You will never see it on MSNBC, on CNN, even some of the alternate news sources, because what it's become to in our country, which is sad to say, is that you truly don't really have a news source that is like fully unbiased. It either swings one way or the other on a multitude of issues. I will say that me getting away from politics is just one of the best things that ever happened because for a while I was just like, all right, I'm kind of like independent. And then I said, okay, maybe I'll look more on the conservative side because people are saying, oh, if you're, medical freedom, you have to belong with this. If you're pro-monument, you have to belong to this. I'm like, no, you really don't, because you can have different viewpoints on either things. And what I
hate politics. I just rather have discussions and,
it's important.
Yeah, I think so. But I do have one last question, and actually two last questions. I'm gonna promise to end it soon because I'm sure we're probably like an hour and a half over in this video. But I wanted to talk about Trump briefly, just really briefly. When people use the Confederate flag and associate it with Trump, because Trump has condemned people who wore the Confederate flag or showed up to his conferences and rallies, to say, in like Confederate flags and Klan gear and stuff like that. But when I was living up in Bradford, PA, it was really interesting because I saw a lot of, and this was like rural PA, Allegheny, close to Buffalo, like we talked about. But in Bradford, PA, you will see a lot of white people who will have like MAGA hats on or like pro-American patriot apparel on, but they will have like these big Confederate flag jackets or Confederate boots or, Confederate like stickers on their cars. Like, and you would just always see I saw this on multiple occasions. Trump associated with the Confederate flag. Where does that come from? Because Trump he's made it clear that, I'm not a supporter of the Confederacy. I don't represent anything that comes from that side, because maybe he does have the opinion too that the Confederacy was negative. But why do you think people often associate the Confederacy with Trumpism and his whole like presidency?
That's a really good point. And I'm glad you brought that up, because basically what was happening at the time of the election was that he originally condemned the Confederate flag. And then as he saw that a lot of his fan base, because of that, were like, oh, then why are we going to vote for you if you're pro cancel culture? You will notice that his tune did switch a little bit. And then towards the end of his presidency, he made statements about the flag being a symbol of, like, Southern pride, or like, against rebellion. And even at certain rallies, like, for example, we would host our own rallies, because certain rallies I was kicked out of, or they would say, well, you can't come in here. I'm like, well, this is my First Amendment. I'm not leaving, because I was here to educate. And what I think was important is you'd also see a lot of Gadsden flags. Betsy Ross was big with Trump too. It was that sign of rebellion, kind of like, people wanted more of that original, like, rebelling against tyranny from him, that they liked, because he wasn't afraid to push certain things. And I've had Trump supporters get mad at me. There are certain things I like about Trump. There are things that I don't like about Trump. I like that he was, for medical freedom, that he did try to prevent certain mandates. I do like that he came out in support towards the end. I do wish he would have done more to kind of clear that up, or to at least have somebody come and explain the truth about certain things, because as it is now, I think the best way to kind of reclaim a lot of that narrative is through education, discussion, not politics. And like, even like the flaggers groups, like, I've had more progress with them than anything political, because the flagging groups are not political. Miss Susan, she runs a tight ship. No one is allowed to swear. And to be able to sit there, proudly forward your colors, have education on hand, be willing to have a discussion. And if you get a one finger salute, I've gotten a double finger salute, I've gotten mooned before, I've gotten garbage thrown at me. To be able to take that and just simply wave and say, have a good day, bless your heart, God bless you. That's more important, because what I've liked best is that seeing that was more productive than people would associate. You've had Republicans say, well, we don't like your flags, or they're not. My favorite was this one: we like what you're doing, but, or I agree with preserving our history, but, and then followed by a whole bunch of personal attacks. I think another reason why they also see Trump being pro-Confederate is maybe just from marketing as well. People make battle flags with his name on it, which I don't agree with, because I'm tend to be more being historically accurate. I am not really a fan of people that make battle flags with, like, they'll say, oh, pro Second Amendment stuff on it. Or
Yeah, and if I'm being honest, like, I think if you logically think about it, I don't think Robert E. Lee would approve of Donald J. Trump. I just don't think so. And I don't think Trump was a real Republican. I'm sorry. I just
he's
don't.
not. He's more like Jefferson Davis, in a way. He's more of like the book kind of words it in a sense,
He's a
not like,
populist. He's a political appealer. He's a populist. That's what he is. I don't think he's a Republican, because look at all the Republicans that turned on him in his own party. People that he
yes.
acquired seats for. He literally helped people win seats, and just about everybody he helped, get a seat, they turned on him.
Liz Cheney was a big one. A
I
few
think
other
Mitch, I
ones.
think Mitch McConnell also turned on him too. I think Mitch McConnell supported him for a little bit, but that goes to show. I think and before we end this, because I'm going to ask you what resources, what do you think we could do to pretty much learn about the Confederacy. But before I say that, I think we both have also acknowledged that politics, politicizing everything. We have a toxic political culture in America. I think we have a toxic government, and I think everybody should be entitled to have their own groups, chapters, clubs, brotherhoods, sisterhoods, even if we don't agree with them, because that's what America is. America is supposed to be about, the melting pot, the diversity, when, like, back in the day, when the government wouldn't help the Black Panthers and they couldn't get a lot of resources because of who they were at the time, they separated and created their own breakfast club. You had the 1921 Tulsa, Oklahoma, Black Wall Street. The federal government, the white government, was not helping African Americans at the time. So they separated and created their own economy. They created their own churches and stuff. I mean, the Confederates, the people in the deep South, and like what the Union states were doing, what Lincoln was doing. They separated and created their own categories. We need to return to that, because attacking people because you don't like what they're in or what they do, it's never going to get anywhere, because all it's going to do is cause war. Because if you attack, because people have to understand, even when it comes to the Confederacy, this is deeper than politics. This is deeper than what we see in our schools. I have learned that this is culture to a lot of people. This is culture to a lot of people. This is truly heritage to a lot of people. Some people eat, sleep, and breathe the Confederacy even to this day. So it's like, there is no way in your actual mind that you think you're going to go and assault somebody, and not even just pertaining to the Confederacy. If somebody is naturally and culturally obligated to something, they give their entire body and life to whatever this is, you you have to expect some sort of clapback, some sort of war, some sort of conflict. And who wants to live in a like war all the time? So I think we need to just, we don't have to accept what these groups support. And, there's a lot of things that I support that a lot of people don't like. But I think what we need to do is to learn how to just mind our business, keep it pushing, and, stop politicizing everything, because politicizing everything, it only causes more division. It only causes more war. But I think Confederate chapters and brotherhoods and sisterhoods, I think they're allowed to exist. They have every right to exist. Pro-Asian groups, pro-Black groups, pro-religion groups, pro-LGBT groups, as long as none of these groups try to infringe on anybody else's rights, I think they should be able to exist. But on that note, my last question is for people who want to learn, including me, who would like to educate themselves more on the Confederacy, these leaders, people that we don't even know about, what sources would you recommend? How would you recommend we go about educating ourselves about this? I mean, like truly, because it's obvious that we're not going to get it from the education system. It's obvious.
Never.
So for people who truly want to go out there and learn about your beliefs and what you support, and just kind of actually get a full understanding of it, what should be the first step we should take, and how should we go about like authentically learning about this culture of the Confederacy?
I would say that it's a great question. There's all different groups that are out there that are wonderful. I would say attend a big event. So like the big event that we do is Lee Jackson Day that a lot of people come to Virginia for. And that is run by several different groups. It's run by the Sons of Confederate Veterans, the SCV. When is that? So that's the group I'm in. SCV is the male group. If you are a male with a direct or collateral descendant of a Confederate veteran, you can join. The other group is the UDC, which is United Daughters of the Confederacy. They're the women's version. And another group that's coming up, which is Order of the Confederate Rose. It's a mixture of people with ancestry, without ancestry, that are just more active. They just,
Oh, wait, is that a new group? Is it like brand new?
It's not necessarily brand new. It was made in the 1990s. It was actually after named after Rose O'Neal Greenhow. And what she was a female, and she was given credit for the success of the Battle of Bull Run because she took in information and she was able to transport that across enemy lines. Wow. She also is a diplomat. She actually sailed across to France and England to try to get support. She died on her way back. The ship had capsized. She fell and she drowned because of the blockade runner that was on the thing caught them, and they were trying to escape. She was jailed by Lincoln. She was jailed at Capitol Prison, which is now the ground on which the Supreme Court sits on. Old Capitol Prison held a lot of political prisoners. It had held females like Rose Greenhow, Belle Boyd, and she was held there with her daughter. She was jailed there. She wrote a whole book about her experience. There is a fantastic video on her life by Emily Lapsardi, who also does presentations. That's a second source. But the OCR, they are about education. They're about getting out there, heritage defense. And all of us are about peace. We're a peaceful group. Everyone is welcome. We don't discriminate. Anyone, regardless of, your religion or culture, come on and join us. We'd be more than happy to have you. We'd be welcome with open arms. We have many men in our group who are Orthodox Jewish. And I always try to be fair, and I'll say, okay, let's
wait, you guys have Jewish Confederate?
Oh, yeah.
Really? I'm shocked.
Tons.
Really?
Tons.
Wow.
And I tell people what I do to try to be fair is because, like,
do you know any personally, or do you just know of them?
Personally, I know quite a few actually personally. I know probably about 7 personally, and I think there was 2 more that I will be meeting soon. But one of them is a rabbi. He's also a chaplain, does fantastic prayers in Hebrew that we're more than happy to have. I've had people that were Muslim. I've had people that we have, I don't want to be offensive and say witches, but Wiccan. Wiccan is one, but then there was another one, nature-based faith. We've had Catholics, atheists, Christians, you name it. It's a diverse group, and a lot of people. I like that,
and I like that because even outside of race, one thing about the Confederacy was it was really big on Westernization. Christianity, returning back to God's roots and culture, whatever people may call it. But I like to see that now it sort of has modernized in a way to the point that you guys are even open to accepting Jews, and you said even Wiccans. Like, that's so shocking. Like, I can't even imagine a Wiccan wanting to join a Confederate chapter, but that's
more than welcome. They're always more than welcome. We do not discriminate. We make that very clear. Our group is not discriminatory, and we tell people if you are a person with evil intent, you're not welcome at all. And same way, another group is the Flaggers group. That's another group which you can get started that way because I know sometimes that maybe people don't have, and our membership isn't expensive, but I know It could be a money thing. If you're a student, sometimes it's also difficult to make, funding for certain things. Flagging is another wonderful thing, is we work with all different groups. We go out there, we'll either flag to educate, and it's fantastic. They're very strict. They say, look, always use clean language. You're always to be respectful. We don't want no conflict. We don't want none of that. We're a peaceful group. We come in peace. We promote peace. We do not promote or condone violence in any way, shape, or form. And have not had issues with that because we run a tight ship, and that's what needs to be shown. And I think our last Lee Jackson Day, it went good because it showed how, you can have fantastic holidays. There at Virginia, they used to celebrate, which I think we need to get back to. It was Lee Jackson King Day. You would celebrate Lee Jackson Day, then you would celebrate Martin Luther King. And it was great because you had so many different cultures coming together to honor heroes.
Really? I didn't know that. Where was this? Was this just a state or like a town like holiday, or what was this? Never heard of
this. Was a state holiday in Virginia, and you want to know who ruined it? It was actually a Republican that ruined it.
Really?
Because they made it political. Yeah.
So do not forget, when you get off here, you have to send me the information about the
Mississippi still celebrates Lee Jackson King Day, I believe. To my knowledge, they do. Lee Jackson King Day, and it's in January, and you're able to have like the whole week, and you're able to celebrate a whole bunch of things. We do a lot of food, and the food is delicious. So I tell people, if not for the flagging, or like we have seminars as well, or the seminars, at least come for the food, because we make a ton of good food and it is incredible. There's also other groups like Save Southern Heritage Florida. They do a lot of different things down in Florida. You actually learn how the monuments law works. You'll learn, how we ended up in this position today. We've had H.K. Edgerton speak, and he was a former leader of the NAACP, and he explains that this is so important to unite with our Southern brothers and sisters, celebrate our differences, have fun with it, learn about different cultures, and we do programs. So like for the SCV, for example, what we'll do at a meeting is we always do, we do our pledges, we do a prayer, and, I am not offended if someone wants to say a prayer. Me as a commander, at least, I would love that. If someone says a Hebrew prayer or Muslim prayer, more than happy to pray with you. Or if they are atheists and they want to step away, that's fine too. I have no issue with that whatsoever. We do a little bit of snacking. We do a program, which could be on different topics. I'm trying to bring in better topics, like homeopathic medicine is one that we're doing in New Jersey soon. It'll be a fun one because people don't know this, but the Confederacy allowed herbal medicine, homeopathy. Union government had banned it.
That's one thing I did do my research on that. That's one thing I would like to say I liked about the Confederacy. They were really big on holistic medicine too. They, you wouldn't really see a lot of opioid usage, manufactured factory, lab created medicines. They were really big on like, at home medicine. So there was really, a lot of people considered it like, oh, stupid, rednecks just didn't have enough intellectual capacity to create the advanced medicines that the, northern region was created. But now look, now today people don't trust the government and the FDA and big pharma. So now people are returning to holistic medicine. So redneck, as they call it, should be like, hi, now joke's back on you. Because it's like, now what we got judged for, you're trying to do now. But this is really, that's just really interesting to know. But Vinny, I want to say thank you so much for
really quick.
Okay, go ahead.
The last two groups that are also important, Monuments Across Dixie. I do book reviews to try to, give out different sources. Our group is actively helping to try to rebuild Monument Avenue. So basically, we're going to be rebuilding monuments, and we'll do monuments of anything. And I think it's important to stress that message, that what a true Monument Avenue should look like. Add on monuments, do monuments of, people that you want, like some of the figures that you like, I like Maya Angelou's incredible. Frederick Douglass is a great one too. Give a monument to him, rebuild something. And we're basically saying, hey, look, this was destroyed. Well, guess what? We're not going to hold any ill will. We're going to build our own, and we're going to build it back, no pun intended, build it back better. We do that. And the other one is SCV Chat. You learn a lot about just general history. And there are other experts in different fields that know a lot more than I do that go on there and they talk. And I think that those are just some of the few sources and groups that, people should check out and maybe have fun with.
That's nice to hear. And I guess before we go, I've been saying this 1,000 times. This is my last time saying this, but I really like what you're doing. I do appreciate it. And a lot of people also don't know, like I said, because the reason I called you Grave Hunter.
Grave Hunter.
Yeah, Grave Hunter, because you do have an initiative to bring back, like African-American representation to the Confederacy, because it's, a lot of people, like I even had the question, why would an African-American want to join the Confederacy? But the truth is that a lot of African-American men and women were part of the Confederacy. They contributed to the culture. They were the culture. And I think it should be properly represented. It should have proper representation. But the sad thing is, to this day, I just found out even from you, there's an initiative amongst like people to like wipe out like Black representation from the Confederacy just to make it look like, and I'm starting, and that's why I got a new perspective on it now, because it's like, I used to just look at it as a white Southern thing. Like maybe this is just a white man thing, a white racist thing. But now the more I educate myself and the more I read, I'm learning that, oh my God, there are all these African American, Confederate soldiers and leaders and people who contributed to these wars. And it's like, here you go now, you're trying to dig up graves and finding information. So just really quickly, because I don't remember what you told me, but it was something along the lines of, you had acknowledged that someone was trying to hide some information or something, and I guess you're trying to you're trying to do something, or you and a group of people are trying to do something to bring back their representation, but it's just not working because I don't know. But the point being, I just feel like people want to try to politicize this and make this a white only thing. But I do appreciate that you're trying to bring back African American representation to this. So with that being said, you can kind of make the last remarks on the representation and what you're doing as far as that.
Absolutely. So basically, what we are trying to do is, people know that New Jersey was the last slave state, and what I am trying to do is figure out who were the last slaves in New Jersey. What happened? Did they stay in New Jersey? Did they move down south? Were they evicted? And what we did find is the last documented slave in New Jersey. He died in the very late 1800s, and basically because of the time in New Jersey, if you were Black, you could not own property, and New Jersey was a Union state. He lived on basically the family plantation. It was in Bergen County. Bergen, at one point, I think 20% were enslaved of that entire population, which is crazy to think that happened in New Jersey. But what happened was, the victor tends to rewrite history. So what you would see after the war is that stuff like that was kind of covered over, glazed over. We are trying to uncover those documents. Okay, who were they? What were their names? Was the number really 15 or was it a lot higher? Like people assume it was, because it did occur illegally too. And what happened was New Jersey had very strict laws on burials. Even with Union troops who were Black were not allowed to be buried in the same cemetery as white Union soldiers. They had to be segregated, which was heartbreaking. We've rediscovered certain cemeteries. We've helped the Sons of Union veterans clean up graves, actively go out there and clean and help to erect tombstones, because they deserve the honor. Both sides deserve honor, I believe. And that is what happens when people make things politicized, is you end up fighting one another, and that doesn't do anything but just make a mess.
And it's ironic because the left, we need Black representation, but we're sleepily going to bury the Black, representation in the Confederacy.
We're trying to make it known.
We're going to start knocking Black faces off of oatmeal and syrup bottles. It's like, you want Black representation, but you take it away. And I understand that a certain history is attached to it, but isn't there a history attached to everything? If we had to wipe away something because a bad history was attached to it, we'll literally have blank white nothing on everything in this country. But I don't want to go more into that, but I think we should definitely do a part 2 to this sometime, because I know people will have a lot of questions, maybe in the next few weeks or month or so. We'll see, maybe sooner. But I think this was a really good and really productive conversation. And, thank you guys for watching episode 2 of Breaking The Monolith Podcast. See you in episode 3 when I decide whatever the topic is going to be.
Thank you. It was wonderful.